As night fell and the area grew quiet and still, an old man looked up at the sky above him, thinking to himself about how Takomi was in junior high school now and yet was still scared and frightened of his own shadow. Suddenly, and without warning, the bush nearby rustled and made a noise. The old man stared at it with sharp and focused eyes, alert to the disturbance. A man slowly and cautiously peeked out from behind the bush with uncertain movements. The old man let out a heavy and tired sigh, then shouted out loud to identify who was hiding there. A boy stepped out from the room at that same moment and called out to his grandfather, announcing his presence. The boy startled and flinched at the sight of the unfamiliar and strange man, questioning who he was with surprise. The man gasped in alarm and pointed out that the kid had snuck up on him without warning. The old man shouted out Takomi's name in recognition and concern. Meanwhile, the man pointed his knife forward and shouted nervously, demanding to know if this was what the old man wanted. The boy's eyes filled with tears from fear and distress at what he was witnessing. Before the man with the knife could react or make another move, the old man struck his knife hand with a swift motion, then swept his foot against the man's legs to knock them out from under him. The man's eyes widened in shock as he crashed forward onto the ground, and the old man yanked his arm behind his back to restrain and immobilize him completely. The boy called out to his grandfather with worry and concern in his voice. The old man flashed the boy a wide and reassuring smile to comfort him. Suddenly, a sharp crunching sound echoed from behind him without warning. He began to turn his body around to face whatever had made the noise, but darkness swallowed and consumed his vision completely before he could see anything. A voice cried out his name in panic and alarm, and then his consciousness slipped away entirely into nothing. The old man opened his eyes to find himself in an entirely unfamiliar place unlike anything he recognized. He tried to call out to see if anyone was present. Just at that moment, a voice spoke and addressed him, calling him a brave youth and asking whether he would become a hero in this new world. The old man stared with a puzzled and confused expression at the man who appeared to be floating in the air above him. He wondered to himself in confusion whether the floating man was referring to him when he used the word youth. He questioned aloud how the man was managing to float up there in that position. The strange floating man gasped in surprise at the response he received. He then introduced himself by the name Israel, adding that his child's name was the same. The old man replied that Takomi was his grandchild and grandkid, not his child. He then whispered quietly to himself about how white everything appeared as he stared at the flowers surrounding him. Israel asked with confusion what exactly the relationship was that the old man had just described. The old man ignored this question and whispered to himself, wondering quietly whether he was truly where he thought he was and what this place actually was. Meanwhile, Israel muttered to himself with growing concern that it appeared he had summoned the wrong person entirely. He fell to his knees in a posture of disappointment and distress, realizing with dismay that this person must be Takomi's grandfather rather than Takomi himself. Still in a state of shock at his surroundings, the old man looked upward and then asked Israel to confirm whether he was in fact a god. The old man gasped as Israel descended from his floating position and stopped hovering, asking him directly whether Takomi was all right and safe. Israel replied with confirmation that yes, he had just checked on the matter. He explained that only the old man himself had died, and that Takomi was completely fine. The old man let out a short chuckle at this news and expressed that, well, that was fine and acceptable then. Israel was slightly surprised by this calm and unbothered reaction, questioning whether the old man truly felt that way about his own death. The old man replied that he reckoned so and that it seemed acceptable to him. Israel then told him with a troubled expression that he had made a serious mistake by summoning the wrong person, and that this error was beyond his power to fix or correct. Silence spread and enveloped the space around them for a brief moment. Then the old man grinned and stated simply that as long as Takomi was safe and unharmed, that was all that truly mattered to him. Still visibly troubled and worried, Israel explained further that once a soul had been summoned to this place, not even he with all his divine power could return it to where it had come from. The old man brushed off these troubling words and instead asked what Israel had originally been planning and intending to do for Takomi in this world. Israel explained that he had intended to reincarnate Takomi in this world and give him a new life here. The old man then offered casually that he could take Takomi's place in the reincarnation if Israel would like that arrangement instead. Israel stood up straight with his face brightening considerably at this unexpected and generous offer, asking with eagerness whether the old man would truly be so willing to do this. The old man let out a short sigh and smiled in response, accepting the situation with calm ease. Israel muttered with genuine feeling and gratitude, blessing the old man for his courage and willingness to accept this fate. The old man commented with amusement that Israel had suddenly become very godlike and formal in his manner of speaking. Israel replied somewhat awkwardly that, well, he was a god after all, and pointed out that the old man really should be more surprised and shaken by everything that was happening and had been revealed to him. The old man told him that the concept of reincarnation into a counterworld was a fairly common and familiar theme in the light novels his grandson enjoyed reading and collecting. Israel replied with understanding at this explanation. The old man then asked that if he was going to be reincarnated, whether Israel could make him a bit younger in his new form. Israel replied readily that, of course, anything the old man wanted was something he could make happen. The old man glanced at him and whispered the word anything to himself quietly while sinking into deep thought about the possibilities. Israel confirmed again that yes, anything was within his power to grant, giving the old man an assuring and encouraging smile. The old man repeated the word anything again quietly in his mind, still lost in thought and consideration. Then he stated that being an old man, he would not want to struggle and have difficulty with any new languages in his new life. Israel told him that he would arrange it so that the old man would know all languages automatically, and would also add on some general knowledge and appraisal skills as additional gifts. He then asked whether there was anything else the old man desired. Without any hesitation at all, the old man listed out everything he wanted from his new life and existence. Israel looked troubled and somewhat overwhelmed at the extent of the list, pointing out that he thought it was all perhaps a bit too detailed and specific. The old man then added as an afterthought that he also wanted an item box to store things. He smiled and explained cheerfully that all of these ideas and requests came from the online role-playing games he had played together with his grandson during their time together. Israel suggested that in that case, perhaps an inventory system would serve the purpose better. The old man asked with confusion what exactly an inventory was in this context. Then his face brightened with delight and excitement as he exclaimed how convenient that sounded and how incredible Israel was for offering it. Israel let out a short laugh and reminded him that he might not look the part of a traditional god, but that is indeed what he was. The old man agreed with this readily. Israel then asked him what his name would be in the counterworld he was being sent to. The old man provided his name, Seitaro Asao. Israel acknowledged this and bid him farewell until the next time they would see each other. A bright light burst and erupted below where Seitaro stood, filling the space with brilliance. While watching him depart, Israel muttered to himself that Seitaro was a truly strange and unusual character unlike anyone he had encountered before. He then spoke aloud, addressing someone he knew was nearby, telling them that he knew they were over there hiding and that they should come out now. Just then, a girl hesitantly and cautiously peeked out from where she had been concealed. Israel turned toward her as the little girl approached him slowly. The girl asked who that person had been that they had just sent away. Israel told her that the person was Seitaro Asao. The little girl then asked where the grandfather had gone. Israel replied that he had been sent to their world, called Philosoph, and that he had specifically sent Seitaro to a shrine located somewhere nice and safe for his arrival. At the very same time and moment on the other side, Seitaro woke up in yet another strange and unfamiliar place. He sat up and observed to himself that this place reminded him of the shrine located in the hills behind his house back home. Looking around, it did not appear on first glance to be a counterworld of any kind. Seitaro walked to the cave exit and looked outside, exclaiming with great surprise and delight at the sight of two moons hanging in the sky, calling them twins in his excitement. He reflected that this seemed to be a rather tasteful and well-crafted counterworld to have been sent to. Seitaro looked more closely and carefully at the sky, noticing something and beginning to comment on it. Just then, a rustling sound echoed from somewhere nearby, interrupting his observation and drawing his attention away. Seitaro stared intently in the direction where the noise had come from. A sharp claw suddenly snapped a tree branch with great force. A bear was biting and holding onto its prey while staring at Seitaro in a threatening and dangerous manner. Seitaro remarked with calm composure that it was quite a violent little bear as the creature came closer to him. The bear threw off its prey to the side and then roared loudly, charging forward directly toward him with aggressive and furious speed. Seitaro muttered to himself, wondering and considering what magic he could use in this situation to deal with the threat. Meanwhile, the bear leapt powerfully into the air above him. Seitaro mumbled that the creature was incredibly frenzied and out of control in its behavior. Without any warning at all, the bear slammed its massive claw downward, but Seitaro swiftly and quickly dodged out of the way of the blow. He commented with mild annoyance at how dangerous this was, telling the bear to calm down just a little bit. The stick he was holding in his hand began to glow with a bright and steady light. He cast a binding spell, and something materialized and wrapped tightly around the bear's body. The bear let out a loud and furious roar. Seitaro looked down at the stick in his hand and remarked to himself that the spell had worked rather well. He then cast another spell, Ice Needles, and instantly a volley of sharp shards of ice appeared and struck the bear. He turned to the wounded deer nearby and cast a healing spell over it. The deer healed almost immediately and opened its eyes. Seitaro told it firmly to be more careful in future, and the deer flew away. Seitaro stood quietly for a moment and offered a small silent prayer for the fallen bear. He then summoned his inventory and marveled to himself that so much could fit inside it. Slowly, the sun began to climb in the sky. Seitaro looked up at it and whispered to himself about what a pleasant morning it was. He stretched his body out in a slow and relaxed series of movements, counting softly to himself as he raised and swung his arms in a gentle rhythm. When he was done, he made his way to a nearby lake and stood at the edge looking at his reflection in the water. He murmured to himself with mild surprise that he appeared about 10 years younger than he expected. Afterward, Seitaro made his way along a path and came upon a proper road, which surprised him. He paused only long enough to take a sip of water before continuing. When he came across a man on the road, he asked for directions. The man told him to turn right. Following the directions, Seitaro soon found himself standing before the entrance of a city. A guard at the gate called out to him and said they would need to see some form of identification. Seitaro muttered to himself that identification was required. He found it remarkable how impressive cities had become. He explained to the guard that he had just come from the countryside and was there to have a look around. The guard scoffed at him and said anyone who did not carry identification must be a true country bumpkin. He then asked, with a note of genuine curiosity beneath the mockery, how Seitaro had even managed to get there. The guard shared a quiet chuckle. Seitaro kept his expression neutral, thinking to himself that their comments were irritating even if they could not be helped. The guard continued with a smug air, asking whether Seitaro had ever seen the identification device before, and answered his own question by assuming probably not. He showed Seitaro how to use it, instructing him simply to place his hand over it. Seitaro followed the instruction. Another guard jumped in with a warning to be careful not to touch something nearby. Seitaro muttered irritably that he was well aware of that, and thought to himself that they clearly had a very low opinion of his capabilities. A different guard then called out more kindly, warning him that the city could be a complicated and sometimes dangerous place for newcomers, and telling him to look out for himself. The guard added that they had also struggled quite a bit when they had first moved to the city from the countryside themselves. He smiled broadly and told Seitaro that if he ran into any trouble, he was welcome to come find them, the gatekeepers. Another guard added a warm welcome to the city of Seoul. Seitaro stepped through the gates. As he walked inside, he thought to himself that it did not seem like an unpleasant city at all. It reminded him of a time long ago when the children at the tea garden had still been very young. He smiled quietly at the memory. He then thought practically that if things worked here the way they tended to work in games, the right first step was to visit the shrine. He made his way there and stepped inside. And when he caught sight of a familiar sculpture, he remarked softly to himself that the craftspeople had done quite a flattering job with the likeness. The area was full of life, wagons moving through, people calling to one another, vendors announcing their goods. Seitaro moved through it all with quiet appreciation, thinking to himself what a cheerful and lively place it was. A man appeared near him and asked if he could spare anything for the orphans, holding out a donation box. Without any hesitation, Seitaro slipped a generous amount of money into it. The man reacted with surprise and joy at the size of the donation. Seitaro said it was nothing for a cost like that, and told the man to make sure the children had something good to eat. The man offered his blessings in return. Seitaro waved it off modestly and moved on. Outside, he came upon a quiet space where a sculpture stood at the center. He recognized it immediately as Israel. He stood before it for a moment and spoke quietly, thanking it for everything and saying that it looked as though he would be able to find a place for himself in this world. He added, with some firmness directed at himself, that this time around he would not go putting himself in unnecessary danger. Elsewhere, through some unseen connection, Israel watched Seitaro from a distance, muttering something about cherishing life and all of that. Israel turned to ask a girl nearby for her thoughts on the matter. Back outside, Seitaro had paid for something and taken a bite, finding it reasonably good though not quite what he had hoped for. He moved on and entered another building. The man inside looked at him with furrowed brows, saying he did not recognize him and asking whether he was sure he was in the right place. Seitaro stood quietly. A woman on the staff guided him to the correct area. He told her he was there to sightsee and also to register as a traveling merchant. She explained that the guild could authorize him as a peddler for a fee of 50,000 ril per year and asked him to use his magic on a nearby device. Seitaro looked at the crystal ball and found it fascinating. He activated it and it glowed brightly, and then something dropped free from it and formed itself into a small card. Seitaro stared at it in amazement, barely able to believe it had transformed into a card. The woman asked what kinds of products he intended to sell. He said food products, and then asked whether she could tell him roughly what things sold for in the city. She reminded him that any rule breaking or misconduct would go on his record and advised him to be careful. He thanked her for the consideration. She sent him off with encouragement, telling him that everyone had to start somewhere and wishing him well. Seitaro thanked her sincerely and said she had been a great help. He continued through the city, murmuring to himself what the young woman had told him about pricing. That 100 Lanka units of tea leaves would fetch around 15,000 ril, which suggested that tea was quite valuable here. He approached a man nearby and asked politely whether the potato he was holding was approximately 100 Lanka in weight. The man sighed and told him he must be joking. That potato was at least 300 Lanka. Anyone could see that just by looking at it. Seitaro was at a food stall, looking over the options with interest and deciding he would get 3 steamed potatoes. The vendor immediately pushed back, insisting 2 would be more than enough for one person. Seitaro went ahead and got 3 anyway, and shortly into eating them he acknowledged to himself that the vendor had been right. It was too much. His meal was interrupted by a commotion nearby. A man shoved past a young boy and berated him harshly, telling him to watch where he was going and calling him useless. The boy stood trembling and in tears, repeating his apologies. When he looked down at what he had been carrying, he found the eggs he had been transporting were cracked and ruined. He cried out for his mother, distressed over what had happened. Seitaro noticed and went to the boy, asking gently what had occurred. The boy led him home, still wiping his tears, and Seitaro followed him inside, telling the boy not to worry and promising to go in and face things alongside him. Inside, the boy's mother was already upset at the sight of the ruined eggs, pointing out that they could not be sold in that condition and expressing frustration that her son could not seem to do anything right. The boy continued to apologize in a small, shaking voice. Seitaro stepped in and calmly stated that he had witnessed what happened and that the boy had done nothing wrong. The woman acknowledged this, but said the real problem was practical. The eggs could not be sold. Seitaro asked whether she had oil and vinegar on hand. The boy ran off and returned with what was needed. Seitaro worked quickly, mixing the ingredients together with a focused ease. When he announced it was done, the woman looked at the result with skepticism, calling it something she had never seen before and questioning whether it was just some idea he had made up on the spot. She took a small taste, and her expression changed entirely. She could not believe how good it was and asked where he had learned to make something like that. Seitaro told her it was a local specialty from his part of the world. The woman wondered aloud whether it might also work well on boiled eggs. He told her he would teach her the method and she could do whatever she liked with it from there. She was overjoyed, thanking him warmly. As a gesture of gratitude for what he had done for her in his business, she insisted he stay the night at no cost. Later, sitting on the bed in his room, Seitaro exhaled with the satisfaction of being off his feet and reminded himself that he needed to prepare for a business discussion the following day. He went through his inventory, noting that the black tea purchasing had been completed. He muttered to himself that it would have been nice to also have tea canisters, though he was aware he could not ask for everything. A quiet memory surfaced, Takomi as a baby, playing with those very canisters. As he settled into sleep, his last thought was a hope that Takomi was doing well. The following morning, Seitaro returned to the guild carrying bags. The guild master was visibly stunned at the quantity he had brought, an enormous amount of tea leaves. People around the town were clearly buzzing about this unusual old man who had appeared among them. That evening at the inn, several men were discussing him in low voices, speculating about who he was and what his real business might be. The quantities he was trading were far beyond what anyone considered normal for an honest merchant, and the general suspicion was that he must be involved in something criminal. They described him as looking, at first glance, like an ordinary poor old man, which somehow made it all more suspicious. Their conversation was interrupted by the young boy from earlier, who jumped in to defend Seitaro firmly, insisting that the old man was a good person. The men were amused and slightly dismissive, suggesting the boy had probably been taken in by someone clever. The boy was adamant, refusing to hear any of it. At that moment, the boy spotted Seitaro entering and called out to him excitedly. Seitaro greeted everyone with a pleasant good morning. The men, seeing him up close, found something about his demeanor unexpectedly disarming. He had a quality about him that reminded them of a grandfather, and they found themselves bowing politely and introducing themselves before they had fully thought about it. The boy tugged at Seitaro and asked where he was heading that day. Seitaro explained that he had sold everything he had brought and was planning to move on to the next city. The boy immediately protested, asking him not to go. Seitaro chuckled warmly and told the boy he would come back to visit, and that in the meantime the boy should be good. The boy shouted after him that it was a promise and that he had to come back. Seitaro continued on his way. After a while he stopped, set up his small table, and took a short rest with some tea. The animals that had been nearby suddenly scattered, which made him pause and look around with a slight frown. Then a heavy thudding sound echoed through the area. He looked down from his vantage point and saw a woman running hard, panting and clearly terrified, with a group of goblins giving chase behind her. A man was also visible, grinning as he ran, holding up a necklace that the goblins were clearly fixated on. They shouted for it to be returned. The girl was crying out for help. Seitaro looked more carefully at the necklace, his expression puzzled by something about it. The man threw the necklace toward the girl. The goblins stopped their pursuit of him and turned on her instead, closing in from all sides. She gasped in confusion and fear, wondering why the goblins were being so relentless. Her voice broke as she whispered an apology to her parents, as though she believed the end was close. The goblins laughed and charged at her. A short distance away, 3 people were hidden in the bushes watching the scene unfold. One of them was satisfied with how it had gone. Another hushed him sharply before they were heard. Then a calm voice cut through the air from above, asking the girl if she was all right. She looked up in surprise. Seitaro stood above her and told her she appeared to be in trouble. Without hesitating further, he jumped down. The girl cried out in alarm at what he had done, telling him it was too dangerous and that he needed to get away. Seitaro told her simply that he could not leave her there. He picked up the necklace and asked whether that was what the goblins were after. They confirmed it loudly, demanding it back and charging toward him. The girl warned him to watch out. Seitaro raised his wand and cast a swamp spell. Water burst outward toward the goblins in a flash. He noted quietly that he had no intention of killing them. He then cast a second spell, paralysis, and lightning crackled through the goblins, stopping them where they stood. He told the girl they needed to move while the goblins were immobilized. The girl stood in stunned silence, barely able to find her words. In the bushes, the 3 observers were equally stunned, none of them able to identify who this person was or where he had come from. The youngest of the 3 was plainly frightened. Seitaro handed the necklace to the girl and told her to keep it safe. She stared at him in confused amazement, asking who he was. He told her they could talk about that later. At that moment, one of the men in the bushes let something slip loud enough to be heard, revealing their presence. The girl immediately pointed out that his inability to stay quiet was the problem. The youngest one in the group groaned in dismay. All three of them stepped out of the bushes. The man tried to play it off with a casual comment about the fight. The youngest offered a relieved remark that everyone was safe. Seitaro said quietly that he had been watching everything unfold from the beginning. The man's expression shifted sharply at the implication, and he turned threatening, suggesting that if Seitaro had not said that, he might have let him walk away. The youngest member panicked and told the man to stop talking. The elf girl with him told him the same. Seitaro looked at the man's arrogance with a steady frown. In the space of a blink, ropes appeared and wrapped tightly around all three of them, binding their bodies completely. The youngest muttered that they were finished. The elf girl pointed out that she had told them so. She stood with her mouth open, taking in what had just happened. After a brief pause, Seitaro approached the city gate and greeted the gatekeeper pleasantly, asking if they could have a moment. The guard recognized him and expressed mild surprise at how quickly he had returned. Seitaro walked in, dragging all three bound figures behind him, and asked if the guard could help him out. The guard reacted with immediate alarm and called out to a colleague, telling him to go and get the chief because something was happening that needed attention. The elf girl looked around her surroundings with a baffled expression, still trying to piece together exactly how she had ended up in this situation. One of the men tied up beside her let out a short, disbelieving snicker. Seitaro scratched his face thoughtfully and acknowledged to himself that things were starting to get a little complicated. The guards moved to untie the three of them. Watching from a short distance away, Seitaro murmured to himself that the process was underway. One of the guards warned the others quietly that the young man who had caused all the trouble was the son of someone important, and that making even a single mistake could put all of them in a dangerous position. The lady made no effort to hide her contempt, observing bitterly that human societies all seemed to work the same way. Seitaro watched the guard struggle with the knots. A guard checked on him and the girl, asking if they were unharmed, and quietly advised them that it might be better to make themselves scarce before things escalated further. Seitaro was puzzled by that advice and wondered what exactly was being anticipated. Meanwhile, the little boy crept around quietly nearby. One of the guards admitted that even they had no real authority over someone like that young man. Seitaro muttered to himself that it was all a tremendous nuisance. The young man smirked as he broke free, and the moment they were brought inside somewhere, the door slammed shut behind them. The lady jumped in shock and demanded to know why they were the ones being held. Seitaro explained that they had said they only wanted to hear what had happened, but he did not finish the thought. It was clear that was never going to be the extent of it. The lady sobbed, blaming herself for dragging him into the situation. Just then someone entered. The boy recognized a newcomer and called out to Seitaro. The man came in carrying food and introduced himself as the master of the Adventurers Guild in that city. Both the lady and Seitaro looked at him steadily. Seitaro asked directly what the man wanted from them, and whether he had come to offer some acknowledgement of the young man's appalling behavior. The guild master told him to watch his words. The lady's expression tightened at that. The man then explained that as far as things stood, they were all innocent without evidence to the contrary. The lady reacted with shock, beginning to protest. The man continued over her, telling them that he had been informed that it was actually Seitaro and the lady who had attacked the others without any provocation. Seitaro, completely calm, asked whether a guild record would count as evidence. The guild master replied that he could not prove such a record had not been fabricated, and added that there was no one present with the ability to use something called nozen. Seitaro picked up a bowl and suggested the man drink it to cool himself down. The lady, taking her cue, pressed it toward the man firmly. The guild master flinched and noted that Seitaro seemed oddly calm for someone in this position. He took a sip and immediately grimaced at the bitterness. Seitaro asked mildly whether he felt a little more settled now. The guild master collected himself and told them that regardless of everything, if they simply admitted to the charges, the punishment would be made lenient. Meanwhile, two guards had quietly moved to take positions behind the group. The guild master added that he had a fairly good idea of what they had been up to anyway. Seitaro asked him to go on. The man explained the scheme he suspected, hiring goblins or similar monsters to attack someone, then stepping in to rescue them at the right moment and claiming gratitude, reward money, and rank points. Seitaro's expression went cold and quiet. He murmured something about the graceful nature of that kind of behavior. The guild master confirmed he was familiar with it. Seitaro then said in a measured tone that the next people the young man chose to target might not be as patient as they had been, and that if that happened, there was no way of knowing whether the young man would make it back out of the forest in one piece. The forest was, after all, a very dangerous place. The guild master flinched. He scratched his head and conceded, saying he would punish them to the maximum extent the guild rules allowed. Seitaro asked what would happen regarding the accusation against them. The guild master said he would see to it that the accusation was withdrawn. Seitaro said that would do. As the man left, he whispered under his breath that Seitaro was a frightening old man. Seitaro smiled pleasantly. The lady thought to herself with relief that things seemed to have resolved themselves. Seitaro turned to the boy and asked if he could have one of whatever the boy was holding. The boy happily obliged. Later, Seitaro made his way back to the inn with the lady. The boy's face lit up when he saw him return, happy that Seitaro would be staying another night. The men at the inn reacted with cheerful enthusiasm when they heard what had happened, congratulating him and saying they had known from the beginning that he was not someone to be underestimated. The lady smiled to herself as she wrote in her journal. The accusations against them had been dropped, and those responsible were to be punished, though not in any public way. She reflected that while human society had many serious flaws in how it operated, there also seemed to be mechanisms within it that worked to correct those flaws, at least to some degree. Somewhere else entirely, Israel was watching events unfold and called out to the little girl to come and look. Israel observed that Seitaro seemed to be doing quite well for himself. When morning came, the young lady and Seitaro prepared to leave the city. The guards at the gate called out warmly to Seitaro as he passed, telling him to take care of himself this time, and meaning it genuinely. Seitaro smiled and thanked them. They set off on their journey together. As they moved through the forest, they encountered monsters along the way and stopped occasionally to pick mushrooms. Seitaro cast a barrier spell, and a glowing shield surrounded them in response. The rustling of something in the dark passed through the night. Another day came. Seitaro called to the young lady and offered her something to drink. She took a sip and exclaimed that his coffee was wonderful. She then asked him, with genuine curiosity, what he had been doing before he became a mage. He told her that he was, and still considered himself to be, simply a tea merchant. The young lady pointed out that the river was not too far ahead. Seitaro noted that she had been saying something different a moment earlier. She admitted with embarrassment that she had a rather poor sense of direction. Seitaro said that would not do, and suggested they navigate their way through the remainder of the forest together. Just then a map appeared in the air before them. The young lady stared at it in genuine shock. Seitaro glanced at her reaction with mild puzzlement. She said in amazement that he had produced a map that clear and detailed without even using an incantation. Seitaro asked whether she could actually see it too. She reminded him that she was a mage herself. Of course she could see it. Then, with growing curiosity in her voice, she asked whether the place he came from was truly somewhere very far away, somewhere so distant that only a god would know of it. Seitaro's face lit up, and he told her she had caught on quickly. She then asked why. If he had been reincarnated, he had not come back as a much younger person. Seitaro replied that he was roughly 10 years younger than he had been. The young lady noted that according to their records, those who were reincarnated typically returned significantly younger than that. Seitaro thought about it, and reasoned that it was probably because he had not developed any serious ailments with his eyes or hips until well into his 70s, so there had not been as much youth to restore. The young lady observed that most humans seem to want to stay young for as long as possible, then added that she probably would not fully understand the perspective, being an elf. Seitaro smiled, and said he could not speak for others on that matter. The young lady suddenly snapped back to something else entirely, and asked with some urgency whether he was telling her that she could not get his coffee anywhere else. He asked, with genuine surprise, whether it had really been that good. She did not quite answer before they were both pulled out of the moment by something else. Voices echoing from within the forest, followed by men stepping out from between the trees. One of them laughed with a mean edge to his voice and commented on the sight of an old man traveling alone. Another agreed that it was a remarkable lack of caution. The third man beside them nodded, saying it was seriously careless of him. As the suspicious group passed by without incident, the man at the center told the others to move on. Seitaro quietly suggested to the young lady that they should get going as well. A little while later, the young lady spotted the village ahead and pointed it out with excitement, noting that it would soon be time for them to part ways. Seitaro let out a small and warm chuckle and told her that traveling with her had been genuinely enjoyable. The young lady thought to herself with urgency that she needed to make sure she recorded more notes before they said goodbye. As they walked the final stretch, Seitaro observed a man passing nearby, and his expression became thoughtful. The young lady noticed and asked what had caught his attention. Seitaro said the man had been carrying an empty basket, but his footsteps had been far too heavy for someone carrying nothing. The young lady suggested with easy cheerfulness that he was probably just one of those people who appeared slimmer than they actually were. Seitaro chuckled, but did not dismiss the thought. They entered the inn and were greeted warmly by the man running it, who asked whether they would be staying the night. Seitaro requested 2 rooms. The man fell into an oddly quiet pause. The young lady immediately offered to help the woman at the desk with something she needed. Seitaro asked the innkeeper whether something had happened. The man explained that the village had only just reopened. It had been attacked by a group of bandits not long before, and they were still grateful that no lives had been lost. Seitaro went quiet for a moment. He then told the innkeeper carefully that those same bandits may have already returned to the village. He had passed a suspicious-looking young man near the gate on the way in. The innkeeper reacted with clear alarm. The young lady and the woman nearby also stopped what they were doing. Seitaro offered that the 2 of them might be able to help and asked if the innkeeper had a moment to discuss it. The man immediately said he needed to go and get the others first. Seitaro stood quietly, turning things over in his mind. Then a loud voice called out to him, and the young lady let out a startled exclamation at the sight of something large. Seitaro calmly told her to stay back and watch. He tapped a finger on his map. Then a massive bolt of lightning struck a large bee that had appeared nearby, dispatching it instantly. The young lady cried out in shock, astonished that he could do something like that. The men who had gathered nearby stared at him with open mouths. One remarked that it was like pest control. Another laughed and called it rather low stakes, then asked about the bandits. A little girl came running to Seitaro. She told him breathlessly that he was strong and asked whether he could defeat the bad people who had hurt her mother. Seitaro smiled warmly and told her it would be all right. That night, the villagers gathered together. A woman in the crowd asked nervously whether the bandits were really going to come back. A man told her they had been advised to move toward the church and shelter there, though he seemed uncertain. The young lady asked Seitaro for his read on the situation. He told her simply that they were coming, and in large numbers, he added, pointing to the map to show her what it indicated. Without warning, Seitaro cast a barrier spell. A burst of brilliant light expanded outward from around them, forming a barrier of impressive size. The young lady said she had never seen a barrier that large before. From further away, a woman watched the light spreading and wondered aloud what it was. The men lurking outside the village murmured among themselves, some wondering whether it was some kind of divine protection. Seitaro grinned to himself and said it was time to go. The young lady responded with eager energy. Hidden in the trees outside the village, the bandits were watching. One of them asked what the glowing light was. Another smirked and speculated that it was probably the shine of gold. A third whispered with a snicker that they were going to get a good haul out of this and take an even better sword while they were at it. Seitaro and the young lady stood at the village exit. Seitaro said it was time to go, and without any hesitation, he cast a paralyzed spell. Something fell from the trees immediately. A shout followed, and the young lady flinched. Two bandits lay unconscious on the ground before them. Seitaro muttered that it had gone well. A man came running frantically to report to someone he called boss. Every one of the men who had been hiding had been caught. The boss could not process what he was hearing. The messenger told him it was some old man who had done it. The boss furrowed his brow at that. The messenger shouted that he would be there any moment. The boss scoffed and said it did not matter. Just cut it down and be done with it. Then a pair of boots came into view. Seitaro and the young lady walked forward together. The boss took one look at the young lady and immediately ordered his men to take the elf alive, seeing her as something he could sell. The men rushed forward. Without hesitating, Seitaro cast the paralyzed spell again. Lightning cracked through the group, and the men cried out in pain before collapsing. The boss, however, remained standing with a smirk. The young lady saw what was coming. In a blur of motion, the boss appeared directly in front of them and came down hard with his weapon. The young lady threw her arms up to shield herself. But before the blow could connect, Seitaro reached out and caught the boss's arms. The young lady slowly opened her eyes. The sword had struck the floor instead. The boss stared at Seitaro in wide-eyed disbelief as his attack was deflected. Seitaro muttered that the man had been a little slow. The boss growled and came at him again immediately. Seitaro blocked the sword effortlessly with his wand. He noted that the man had somewhat more stamina than the others, then calmly told him he would not be killing him and to settle down and cast another spell. The boss managed only a short burst of outrage before he lost consciousness. Seitaro looked at the fallen men around him and sighed quietly, saying they had all stolen from people and hurt them, and now they would receive what was due to them. He cast a binding spell followed by a float spell, and the unconscious bandits rose into the air. The young lady stared with her jaw open in complete shock. Seitaro said it was time to go home. Back at the village, the gathered people had broken into excited chatter. Someone recognized one of the floating figures as the man who had robbed their shop. Others were still trying to understand what had happened. Then Seitaro appeared behind them, asking politely if they could be let through, and explained that all of the bandits were accounted for. The people stared upward in stunned silence. Someone asked in disbelief whether the old man had done all of this. Seitaro told the young lady she could let go now. The man beside them turned to the chief with surprise. The chief stood speechless, asking whether Seitaro had really done this and protected their entire village. Seitaro smiled and said he supposed he had. The chief said he did not know how to begin thanking him. Just then, the little girl noticed a necklace on the ground and picked it up. She came running to Seitaro immediately. He turned to her. She was in tears as she thanked him. The chief nodded with quiet respect. Seitaro gave the girl a warm smile and told her of course. He then turned to the chief and said that while he was just an old man, he had some information that might prove useful. He asked if the chief had a moment. The chief responded without any hesitation, eager to hear. Elsewhere, in a different place entirely, a maid knocked on a door and asked permission to enter. She came in and informed the man she addressed as Lord Orley that the goods had been recovered. She added that the situation had become considerably more complicated than expected. Lord Orley repeated the complication back with disdain. Some old man in a pointed hat, a common person with the nerve to stand up against a noble. He called it disgraceful. The maid simply smiled. Lord Orley let his smirk settle and said quietly that if the man was old, he would have no great difficulty in ensuring the old man would not be around for much longer. A loud explosion echoed through the room. The woman flinched, and Seitaro broke into a cold sweat. The young lady was breathing heavily while the crowd around them erupted into confused chatter. Someone in the crowd wondered aloud what the two of them were doing. Another replied that he had no idea. They were kneading flour and working with ingredients, but whatever they were making was clearly not bread. Someone muttered curiously that he wondered whether it would taste any good. The sound of chopping filled the air alongside the bubbling of a pot of broth. Then Seitaro announced that it was done. The people murmured among themselves, noting the brown color and remarking that they had never seen anything like it before. As soon as they tasted it, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. People exclaimed that it was delicious, that it was incredible. The chief could barely contain himself, demanding to know what it was and declaring that it had to be a specialty from wherever the old man came from. Seitaro told him he could teach him how to make it later. The chief, still buzzing with excitement, said he was going to speak to the Lord about arranging a proper reward for clearing out the bandits. Seitaro told him not to bother himself with that. The chief insisted that they absolutely must. Seitaro chuckled and said that it was the duty of the elderly to be of use to younger people. The chief considered that, said he supposed that was true, and let the matter rest. One of the men then came in to interrupt, telling the chief that the city of Foz had been in contact about the bandits. The chief acknowledged it. Seitaro said nothing. The chief observed dryly that they moved quickly whenever there was money involved. The man added that some of the Lord's people were apparently on their way to the village. The chief sighed and said, with some embarrassment, that the Lord responsible for their area, a man named Oswald, was a deeply greedy man. Seitaro thought to himself that it was the same everywhere. Laughter drifted over from where the children were playing nearby. The chief watched them with a soft expression and said the children were feeling the good mood too. Seitaro smiled and said he hoped the world would be a different place by the time those children grew up. The chief agreed that was exactly what they were all working toward. They went inside and sat down to have a proper discussion. Seitaro told the chief not to try to defend the whole village at once. Instead, he advised creating a concentrated evacuation site and building their defenses around that. The chief nodded and said that was something they could manage. Seitaro also suggested gathering all the young men in the village and training them to form their own security force. The chief was enthusiastic and said they would start immediately, though he worried it would be difficult to do without the bandits finding out. Seitaro chuckled and told him it was actually better if they found out. A village that appeared capable of putting up real resistance was one that bandits tended to avoid. The chief scratched his head and admitted that made a great deal of sense. The young lady refilled the cups with tea. The chief, curious, asked Seitaro whether he had been in the military before becoming a mage. Seitaro replied that he had been a tea farmer. He thought to himself that he was not really a mage either in the traditional sense. The chief stared at him in shock. Seitaro offered him some of the tea and explained that it came from his own tea garden. Just regular tea, he said simply. The moment the chief took a sip, his eyes went wide and tears began to well up. He said that the aroma and the flavor were completely unlike anything he had tasted at the Lord's Manor. Seitaro said he was glad to hear it. The chief continued, and the mention of the tea garden reminded him of something. The village crops had not been faring well lately, and he asked whether Seitaro had noticed anything about the fields. Seitaro thought it over and then asked whether they were using manure. He advised the chief to gather fallen leaves, turn them into leaf mold, and work it into the soil. He explained that the leaves would be ready to use when they had lost their original shape. He added that mixing in the ash from their stoves would also do good for the soil. The chief wrote everything down with great care and then let out a cry of heartfelt relief, thanking Seitaro and saying he had been enormously helpful. He hurried off to share the information with everyone. Before he could go, Seitaro mentioned that something had been nagging at him about the Lord and the treasure he claimed had been stolen by the bandits. The chief flinched visibly and quickly looked away. After a hesitant moment, he admitted quietly that the Lord's stated list of stolen items did not match the amount of treasure that had actually been recovered from the bandits. Seitaro murmured that the Lord had claimed more than twice the value of what had been found. The chief fell silent. Their discussion ended shortly after. The young lady distributed snacks to the children while Seitaro cast a fishing line into the water. The children watched with wide eyes as he pulled in a catch. Then the chief came running toward him, out of breath, saying he had finally tracked him down. He explained that men from Foz had arrived. Seitaro looked at him with quiet curiosity. Two men strode toward them as a crowd gathered. The village cat had also stopped to watch. Someone in the crowd asked what the Foz guildmaster was doing there. Someone else noted that the man behind him appeared to be the head of the Foz guard. The guildmaster approached and addressed Seitaro with broad energy, saying he had heard about the famous old man who had taken down an entire bandit group using magic. Seitaro replied briefly that yes, he had. The guildmaster introduced himself as Gould, master of the Foz Adventurers Guild. He said that the Lord had sent them to collect the bandits and the recovered spoils, and asked whether Seitaro would hand everything over to them. The chief stood behind him looking worried, thinking anxiously that he hoped Seitaro would be careful about what he agreed to. Someone in the crowd whispered that Gould was being rather presumptuous. Seitaro smiled and said that was perfectly fine. Gould was mildly surprised at how quickly Seitaro had agreed, but thanked him and moved on. The head guard behind Gould watched with a sharp and calculating eye. The chief exhaled with relief. Seitaro said they could come with him now to collect everything. Gould followed along, muttering under his breath that the old man had turned out to be rather spineless after all. The head guard, a man named Jilk, agreed quietly that even he himself could not disobey the Lord, so there was certainly no reason to expect some random old man to. Gould told Jilk to stop talking. Jilk stopped and said something that caught his eye. Gould turned to look. There they saw Seitaro standing on the bridge ahead of them. Gould reacted with sudden alarm. Jilk told him to look more carefully, not at Seitaro, but at everything around him. The two of them moved quickly and quietly behind a bush. A house cat was sitting nearby. Gould said in a low and worried voice that it was not a cat he was concerned about. Jilk muttered that Seitaro was surrounded by assassins. He grabbed Gould before he could move and told him to wait, pointing out that those assassins had almost certainly been sent by someone specific. Gould turned on him and demanded to know whether Jilk was suggesting they just stand there and let the old man die. Jilk let out a slow sigh. On the other side of the bridge, two assassins were hidden and waiting. Then a voice suddenly rang out nearby, demanding to know what they were doing there. One of the assassins panicked slightly at the unexpected interruption. The other hissed that it did not matter and told his partner to just go ahead with it. A loud commotion erupted behind Seitaro. He turned quickly and saw the assassins engaged in a fight with Gould and Jilk. One of the assassins had grabbed Gould by the throat. Gould seized the assassin's hand with sharp focus and threw him, but the moment he did, another assassin appeared from behind with a shout. Jilk screamed a warning. The cat nearby flinched at the noise. Seitaro cast his paralyzed spell, and lightning struck the assassins immediately. Jilk reacted with stunned disbelief, surprised to find himself caught in it as well. After a brief moment of confusion, they managed to secure and capture all of the assassins. Jilk muttered that it had been a close call. Seitaro chuckled and said he understood. Gould let out a heavy sigh. He identified the two captured assassins, members of their own guild, one named Dud at Class C, and the other named Manga. He muttered quietly that it might actually be the two of them, rather than Seitaro, who were in the greater danger now. He turned to Seitaro and began to say that he might have already figured out who had hired the assassins, but Seitaro cut him off gently and told him he did not need to say it. Gould muttered under his breath about why things had come to this. Jilk said that regardless of how it had all unfolded, they were going to need Seitaro to come with them to Foz. Seitaro agreed without protest. Afterward, they stood outside the village preparing to leave. The boy asked Seitaro if he was going away. The captured assassins floated behind them tied up neatly. Seitaro told the boy he would be back, and that the boy should behave while he was gone. He smiled warmly, even as the boy began to cry. Then a voice called out, and the young lady came running toward them, breathless but relieved she had made it in time. She handed Seitaro something. Seitaro opened the bag and smiled at the familiar sight of udon inside. She explained that she had taken a method he had taught her, adjusted it slightly, and used wind magic to dry the noodles. Boiling them again would bring them right back to their proper state. The chief marveled at her ingenuity. Seitaro thanked her warmly and told her to take care of herself. They said their goodbyes. As they set off, Seitaro asked whether the journey would take around 6 days. Gould replied that with his own legs, it would probably be closer to 7. Seitaro muttered that it was a long way. Gould noted that for him and Jilk, it would be a round trip. Night came, and they built a bonfire, sat around it, and ate together. Jilk sighed, not quite understanding how anyone could eat well under these circumstances. Gould replied that even if their prisoners were criminals, they could not let them go hungry. Jilk pointed out that it was the two of them doing all the hauling. Seitaro asked with genuine concern whether that was tiring, and offered the use of his inventory to lighten the load. Both Jilk and Gould turned to stare at him in stunned surprise at the mention of an inventory. As the night grew deeper, only Jilk and Gould remained awake. Gould muttered quietly, glancing between the sleeping assassins and the old man, wondering what kind of person Seitaro really was. Jilk asked who exactly he was. Gould said he had no idea, but noted that at the very least Seitaro did not seem like a bad person, though he found himself wondering what was going to happen when they arrived. Jilk pointed out that the assassins were living evidence of the Lord's crimes. Gould groaned and called the Lord a greedy scoundrel, saying that if the man were not of noble rank, they would have dealt with him a long time ago. Behind them, Seitaro stirred and woke. He told them he thought it was time for shift change. Gould flinched with surprise at his sudden voice. Seitaro smiled and poured them both some tea to help them sleep. One of the assassins woke and glanced around. Then, without any warning, the ropes binding them began to loosen on their own. The man stared at them in shock. Without hesitating, the assassins bolted and ran. Seitaro watched them go in silence, without making any move to stop them. When morning came, a loud cry of dismay rang out. The assassins had escaped, while the watch had dozed off. Seitaro let out a small laugh and scratched the back of his head. Nothing remained but the empty ropes and the footprints left in the dirt. Gould stood staring at the scene with quiet dread. He thought to himself that without the assassins they had no evidence to present. He said they could not possibly report back like this. Jilk wondered aloud whether the Lord's own people had been involved in the escape. He then asked whether the treasure was at least still safe. Seitaro confirmed that all of it was securely stored in his inventory. He added that while he could not exactly call an apology, he had prepared a warm meal for them. Gould demanded to know how Seitaro could possibly think this was the right moment for eating. Jilk muttered that it smelled interesting and pointed out to Gould that it actually looked quite good. Gould grabbed the bowl firmly and declared that he was not going to be won over by something as simple as food. The moment he took a bite, he went completely silent. Jilk, meanwhile, kept repeating between mouthfuls that it was good. Seitaro watched their reactions with a quiet and contented smile. They continued their journey. Gould raised the problem hanging over them. How on earth are they going to explain all of this in their report? Seitaro told him calmly not to worry. Jilk announced that they had arrived, and a sturdy gate rose before them. Seitaro told them not to worry. He was not going to get either of them into any trouble. He asked them to simply leave it to him. Jilk and Gould exchanged uncertain glances with each other. Gould burst out demanding to know where the old man was and whether anyone had heard anything. The woman replied nervously that she had received a message from Seitaro, who had asked them to wait until he returned from the Commerce Guild. Gould reacted with alarm, barely able to believe what he was hearing. He pointed out that Seitaro had made an enemy of the Lord, and seemed completely bewildered that the old man could be this relaxed about the situation. Jilk apologized and told Gould that he himself actually had something important he needed to attend to before long. Gould turned on Jilk in disbelief. He muttered anxiously that everyone around him was taking things far too lightly. Outside, heavy rain was falling steadily. At the Foz Commerce Guild, a man examined the coffee beans closely and remarked on their extraordinary aroma. Seitaro agreed that the flavor was equally impressive. The woman asked where the beans had come from. Seitaro told her he had brought them from his homeland, and then offered them each a cup of coffee to try. The moment they tasted it, both of them reacted with amazement. The man murmured that even their finest quality coffees could not compare to this in aroma or color. Seitaro suggested they discuss pricing first, and proposed a figure he had in mind, above market price, at 150,000 rils per 100 lanka. The woman immediately rejected the figure, but not in the way he had expected. She said the price was far too low for something of this quality, and that she had never encountered beans this remarkable before. She countered with 200,000 rils per 100 lanka. Seitaro was taken aback and asked quietly whether that was really all right. The man confirmed that they saw that much value in the product. Seitaro stared at them both for a moment, genuinely stunned. He then told them he had something else to show them. He produced a jar of finely ground coffee powder and poured some into a cup. The two watched with barely contained excitement as he demonstrated that all one had to do was pour hot water over it, and the drink was ready. The woman exclaimed that she wanted to know what other remarkable things he had been keeping to himself, and pleaded with him to do business with them. Seitaro agreed, and they proceeded to conduct a final check of the goods. After a brief pause while the man confirmed the quantities, 10,000 lanka of each product, the woman thanked him for the excellent business. The man handed over the payment. Seitaro smiled and said the pleasure had been his. Then he caught himself and mentioned that he had a few things he wanted to ask them about the city. The woman said of course, and suggested they find somewhere to talk. They stepped outside into the rain and eventually found a place to sit. Seitaro muttered to himself as they settled in that coffee was quite an expensive commodity. The woman pointed out that the cookies in the shop they had chosen paired wonderfully with tea. The man took a sip of the tea available there and could not help comparing it to the coffee from earlier, noting that it tasted flat by comparison. The woman reminded him it was still considered good quality coffee. She added that the very best was reserved for the nobility. Seitaro said that the nobles were actually what he had wanted to ask them about, specifically their lord. The woman named him Oswald Orley. Seitaro confirmed that was the one. A waiter arrived and set their meals on the table. The woman turned to her companion, a man named Calf, and waited. Calf hesitated and then said that it was only a rumor, but he had heard that a group of bandits had recently been captured and brought to the city, and that the lord had ordered them all executed immediately. The woman added that he had done so without taking any real time to question them. Seitaro fell quiet. The woman continued, saying that everyone in the city had noticed that something was wrong with Oswald, and asked whether Seitaro knew something about it. Seitaro told him honestly that he had become entangled in something fairly serious. He explained that he had captured a group of bandits who had attacked a village, and that it appeared those bandits had been operating with the support of the Lord. Calf reacted with shock, asking whether that meant all the bandits had been silenced to prevent them from talking. Seitaro responded with silence. The woman said quietly that it was beginning to make sense. Calf suggested that perhaps they could bring the matter to the guard. Seitaro said no and told them that everything they had shared was very useful information. He thanked them warmly, saying that as business partners who did their work so well, he trusted what they told him more than most. Calf and the woman both smiled. Just then a familiar voice cut through the noise. Gould had found him at last, and said he had been searching everywhere. Seitaro asked Gould calmly whether something had happened and where Jilk was. Gould replied that the two of them were not joined at the hip. Calf and the woman looked over at Gould with surprise. Gould glanced at them and pointed out to Seitaro that he was their most important witness and should not be wandering around chatting with people. The woman groaned with quiet annoyance. A waiter asked Gould politely whether he would like to sit down. Gould flinched and stammered a thank you, his face going slightly red as he quickly looked away. The woman barely managed to keep herself from laughing. Calf then added one more piece of information, mentioning that he had heard the Lord's parlor maid was said to be an absolutely formidable and frightening figure. Seitaro asked about the maid. The woman confirmed that yes, the rumor was that over the past few years the maid had been the one driving the change in Oswald, pushing him toward increasingly terrible behavior. Gould asked in alarm what they were talking about, and then immediately pointed out to Seitaro that he had just told these people what had happened. Seitaro told him to calm down and said he would explain everything later. He then said thoughtfully that where there was smoke, there was usually fire, and that he would very much like to see for himself what this maid and this lord actually looked like. As night gradually fell and the rain continued outside, a very different scene was unfolding elsewhere. The maid stood, gripping a whip, her eyes cold and narrowed, demanding to know what the men before her thought they had been trying to accomplish. Lord Oswald snickered nearby. One of the men cried out that things had not gone as they had been told. It had not just been the old man they had to deal with. The maid's brow tightened, and she asked him to continue. The man cried out again in pain. The maid asked whether he had come back without a single jewel, pointing out that all he had done was run. Behind her, the lord cheerfully suggested a beheading for them as well, clearly enjoying himself. The assassins' faces twisted with terror. The maid shot him a sharp look, and Lord Oswald immediately backtracked, laughing it off as a joke. One of the assassins spoke up carefully, suggesting that the old man, while powerful in support magic, was still just an old man, and that if someone skilled enough were to grab his wand and bind him, they could probably handle him. The maid cut her off mid-sentence, saying she understood what was being implied. Without any warning, she launched a kick, that she was being asked to clean up their mess herself. She stared at them coldly. Lord Oswald muttered in worried tones about what she was doing to the walls. Later that night, in the hall of the manor, one of the other maids asked a colleague whether she had seen Lord Orley. The maid replied that she had not seen him that day and thought he was occupied with something. The first maid said that someone had come wanting to meet with him. The butler said the situation seemed suspicious and announced that he would go and have a look for himself. The sound of knocking echoed through the air as Seitaro neared the gates of the mansion. Seitaro expressed relief that they had finally opened the gate. The butler asked who was there and what they needed, and told the butler that he had simply come to see the lord of the estate. He asked the butler to pass along the message that someone by the name of Asao had come to pay a visit. The butler responded with irritation, informing him that Lord Orley did not receive or entertain visitors who came without prior appointments, and told him to go home. Seitaro pressed the matter, asking the butler to at least relay the message, and expressed confidence that the lord would be quite eager and willing to meet with him once he heard. The butler grew annoyed and questioned what he was talking about. Just at that moment, a maid interrupted the exchange with a polite greeting. The butler turned to her in surprise. The maid stepped in and told him that it was all right and that she would personally deliver the message to the lord on Seitaro's behalf. The two of them then entered the mansion together. The maid asked Seitaro to wait in place for just a moment while she went to inform the lord of his arrival. Seitaro thanked her warmly. The maid smiled at him and left the room, leaving Seitaro alone in the quiet silence of the mansion interior. Seitaro let out a sigh as he looked around and took in his surroundings. Before too long had passed, the maid returned and apologized for the interruption. She smiled and announced that she had brought him some tea, inviting him to make himself comfortable and at ease. Seitaro thanked her again. Without any hesitation, Seitaro took a sip of the tea. He thought to himself about the aroma and flavor, recognizing that this tea was definitely the same one that he had given to the chief of a certain village. This realization told him that the maid already knew who he was and what his connection to the area was. The maid grinned in response to his observation without denying it. Seitaro's eyes sharpened and became focused with alertness at this confirmation. The maid explained to him that Lord Orley took great pains and effort to understand every detail of the lives of his people and those in his territory. Seitaro then asked directly whether the people of that village would be harmed if he did something that was considered out of line or unacceptable. The maid replied that of course that would not happen under normal circumstances, but added with an implied threat that accidents did happen from time to time. Footsteps echoed across the room from somewhere nearby. A cheerful and loud voice interrupted the atmosphere, exclaiming with theatrical surprise, as if questioning whether some kind of mistake had been made. Lord Orley entered the room together with his assassins. One of the assassins warned Lord Orley to be careful and exercise caution. Seitaro simply sat there in silence without reacting. Lord Orley stepped forward and looked at Seitaro with amusement, commenting that this was just a frail and weak old man before him. He jokingly and roughly smacked Seitaro, demanding that he say something in response. However, before Lord Orley could say another word or make another move, Seitaro grabbed hold of him and kicked his leg out from under him, crashing Lord Orley down to the floor in the blink of an eye with startling speed. Seitaro remarked calmly that he supposed accidents did indeed happen, echoing the maid's earlier words back at them. Lord Orley shrieked in panic and pain, ordering his men to get rid of Seitaro immediately. Just then, the assassins rushed forward toward them. The maid clenched with frustration internally, cursing these people for ruining everything with their reckless actions. Seitaro took out his wand in preparation. One of the men shouted an order not to flinch and commanded the others to grab Seitaro's wand away from him before he could use it. Seitaro directed a sharp and focused look at them. One of the women among them cast a spell, calling out Fireball, and instantly fire erupted and surrounded her in a blaze. Lord Orley screamed out in horror about his manor and the damage being done to it. A large and powerful fireball shot forward directed at Seitaro. One of the men snickered and questioned whether they had gotten him. But as the thick smoke cleared and dissipated, a silhouette emerged from within it, revealing Seitaro standing completely unharmed and casually patting the dust from his clothing as though nothing of significance had occurred. The man stared in stunned horror and called him a monster in disbelief. Seitaro muttered quietly about support magic and its uses. The man from earlier shouted over everyone, demanding silence and telling them that all Seitaro had on his side was magic. He ordered everyone to overpower and overwhelm him by sheer force of numbers. Seitaro replied calmly that it was all about how one used magic rather than simply having it. The maid gritted her teeth tightly and whispered a curse under her breath at the situation. Without wasting any time at all, Seitaro cast a spell, calling out the commands for float and bind simultaneously. One of the men groaned at being caught again by his magic. From behind Seitaro's position, the maid sprang forward with sudden speed, clutching her knife tightly and raising it above his head in preparation to strike him down. Suddenly, a massive explosion erupted without warning. The entire manor shook and trembled from the force of the blast. Lord Oswald grinned with satisfaction, declaring that Seitaro must be dead now. The maid glared with fury, demanding to know what he had done. She then muttered in confusion as she realized she was unable to move her body at all. Seitaro replied that she was paralyzed and unable to act. He muttered his observation that everyone in the room had turned yellow in color on his detection system. The Lord gasped in shock and then deflated with despair, crying out in desperation whether Seitaro cared at all about what would happen to that village as a result of his actions. He shouted this question with genuine distress. Footsteps approached from outside, causing Seitaro to turn toward the sound. The butler and Gould burst inside the room together with urgency. The butler shouted out for Lord Orley in alarm. Gould demanded to know whether the Lord was present and where he was. As they took in the scene of what had happened inside the room, Gould exclaimed with disbelief at what Seitaro had done and demanded to know what he was thinking. He looked at the Lord who was being tied down and restrained, and told Seitaro with exasperation that this was not good at all. The maid grinned at the new arrivals and the complications they brought. Lord Orley glanced at them from his restrained position, a wide grin spreading across his face as he sensed an opportunity. Seitaro let out a short sigh at this development. Gould gasped in shock at something happening up above as well. Meanwhile, the butler rushed to the Lord's side, screaming in distress about Lord Orley's situation and demanding to know what was happening. Gould scolded Seitaro sharply, questioning whether he was completely without sense or thought. Seitaro replied that he had actually put considerable thought into this plan. Gould shouted back in disbelief that this result was what he had come up with after all that thought. Seitaro smiled and told him that he had things taken care of and under control, and told him to simply watch and wait for what would happen next. Gould scowled in response. Just then a voice spoke from outside, and it was directed at Gould, telling him to let certain people through and into the room. A group of people marched inside the manor with purpose and authority. A person named Jilk commented to Seitaro that he had created quite a mess. Gould gasped in surprise at recognizing Jilk's presence there. Suddenly an older man called out firmly to Orley by name alone without any title. Lord Orley flinched visibly in shock at hearing this voice. He exclaimed with recognition that this was his uncle standing before him. The old man declared with heavy disappointment and sorrow that what he was seeing here was completely inexcusable and unforgivable behavior. He stated that his late brother must be rolling in his grave at the sight of what his son had become and done. A woman among the group smiled and expressed her relief and gladness that they had arrived in time, addressing Seitaro by his name. Seitaro thanked her warmly, calling her by the name Adi. He then turned to Gould with some amusement and pointed out that Gould had thought he was just a foolish and reckless angry old man, had he not. Gould stumbled over his words in an attempt to clarify what he had meant. The guards moved in and captured the assassins who were present. Jilk ordered the guards to grab the remaining others who had not yet been secured. The guards shouted their acknowledgement and confirmation of the order. At the same time, the old man who had arrived approached Lord Orley directly and told him clearly and firmly that he could no longer allow him to maintain control and authority over this lordship, given what had transpired. One of the other guards called out to the maid, announcing that she was to be taken as well. A smirk crept slowly across her lips at this announcement. The guard gasped in alarm. In one swift and fluid motion, the maid slipped past the guard with skilled agility, driving her knife into his side and wounding him before sprinting quickly toward the exit to escape. Jilk shouted out asking if the wounded man was all right. One of the men warned the others that she was carrying weapons. The maid reached under her skirt and grabbed another concealed weapon that she had hidden there. Seitaro stood firm and unmoving in place, his gaze sharp and focused entirely on the maid and her movements. The maid spoke coldly and directly to Seitaro, telling him that he was going to have to let her through and allow her to pass. Just before the knife she threw could strike and hit him, Seitaro cast a barrier spell to protect himself from the blow. Gould shouted a curse in frustration. A large explosion erupted from Seitaro's magic. However, the maid managed to dodge and escape its impact with skillful movement. Gould screamed out to Jilk, ordering him to pursue and catch her before she could escape. The maid glanced behind her and saw Jilk coming after her with speed. Jilk muttered to himself that he did not particularly like the idea of cutting up or harming women, but the situation left him no choice. He swung his sword at her. She blocked it instantly with her own weapon, though his blade managed to graze and cut her arm in the exchange. Smoke began rising and coming out of a small bag she held in her hand. Seitaro gasped as he recognized what this meant and began to speak a warning. Before he could finish expressing his concern, a loud and tremendous explosion shook and rattled the entire manor to its foundations. The following day, Gould expressed his surprise that the maid had actually blown herself up to escape and avoid capture. He reflected with some gravity on the fact that someone like her had been secretly manipulating and controlling the Lord from behind the scenes all along. Joke replied that things had ended reasonably well, all things considered, despite the chaos. Gould muttered that Seitaro was certainly one completely unpredictable and reckless old man to have put up a barrier to protect everyone in that critical moment. Joke added that Seitaro had even gone so far as to save Oswald, and had also sold them some good and quality coffee beans on top of everything else. Gould responded with continuing frustration, questioning why Seitaro had kept his plans hidden and secret from him. Joke replied simply that Gould had a terrible poker face and would have given things away. Gould's brows furrowed together at this assessment. He then shouted his firm disagreement with this characterization of himself. Joke replied with an unconvincing and sarcastic agreement that did nothing to settle the matter. A man interrupted their exchange, calling out to the captain to announce that they were finished with their training session. Joke stood up and told the man that he would come with him to check on things. Glancing around the room, Adi greeted Gould and asked where Seitaro was, noting his absence. Gould replied that Seitaro was not there with them. Adi pressed further, asking whether Gould knew where Seitaro had gone. Gould replied that he had heard there was a notice indicating that Seitaro had gone to the wood dungeon. Adi gasped in alarm and distress at this news. She explained urgently that there had been reports of a woman who matched the description and appearance of the maid seen walking on the streets near that very area. She murmured quietly to herself, expressing her hope and worry that Seitaro was safe and all right wherever he was. Meanwhile, at the wood dungeon itself, Seitaro looked around the unfamiliar surroundings with uncertainty, appearing to be lost and without a clear sense of direction. Just then, he heard a rustling sound coming from the bushes located directly behind him, alerting him that something was nearby. At the Belkin located in the town of Foz, two children were playing outside together in the open air. The little girl announced cheerfully that she had fried something in oil and that it was finished and ready. The other girl reacted with surprise and curiosity, asking what exactly was being fried and how it was done. The little girl explained with pride and satisfaction. Watching the two children from a distance, the old lady smiled warmly at their playful and innocent interaction. The little girl then wondered aloud when the grandfather figure was going to come back to them. The other girl fell silent for a moment in thought, and then said that she believed it would be today, but then her voice trailed off with uncertainty. The old man had said he was headed to the wood dungeon, and the girl pictured in her mind the scary and dangerous dungeon filled with frightening monsters. The little girl exclaimed with fear at the thought, wondering aloud whether there were ghosts in the dungeon, and suggesting that they might even be scarier than her own mother. Suddenly, and without warning, a woman passed by their location. The two children flinched in shock at her sudden appearance. The girl stood up and asked her mother whether that grandfather figure would be all right and safe. The woman paused at this question and considered it, acknowledging Seitaro by name and noting that a dungeon might be too dangerous and risky a place for an old man to venture into on his own. The two children's faces twisted and contorted with worry and fear at this response. With a playful and teasing grin, the woman joked that by now he had probably already been eaten by a ghost in the dungeon. The children screamed in shock and distress at this frightening suggestion. The older girl murmured with genuine worry, while the little girl whispered her thought that perhaps they could ask Guild Master Gould to go and help him. At that very same time and moment, something darted and moved quickly towards Seitaro from within the bushes nearby, the force of its movement making the leaves sway and rustle wildly around it. Yet nothing could actually be seen or identified, with only the sound of rustling giving any indication of its presence. Seitaro turned to look in that direction, froze in the middle of his step, and then glanced back again with cautious attention. Just as he was about to move on and continue walking, something rushed toward him again, forcing him to stop in his tracks once more. When he spun around to face the source of the noise directly, the sound suddenly stopped completely. From within the bushes, something flashed briefly into view, revealing a pair of lips curled upward into a playful grin. A cat then leapt out from the bushes with a loud meow, as though it was trying its best to scare and startle him. Seitaro muttered with mild amusement at this reveal. He reached down and picked the cat up into his arms, commenting that it was such a beautiful cat to be found in a place like this dungeon environment. Suddenly and unexpectedly, the cat's stomach let out a loud rumble of hunger. Seitaro noted with good timing that he was just about to sit down and have some tea, and the cat meowed back at him in what seemed like enthusiastic agreement. As he fed the hungry cat some food, Seitaro asked whether the cat was enjoying it. The cat's eyes sparkled and shone with delight, conveying an expression that seemed to say how wonderful and good it tasted. Seitaro muttered to himself that it was a good thing he had made these reduced sugar donuts to share. He then wondered to himself whether he had also seen this very same cat back in the town of Foz, and in that village he had visited before. The cat simply stared back at him without any response or confirmation. Seitaro smiled at this and said perhaps, leaving the thought open. The cat walked up closer to him and meowed loudly, as if demanding more of his attention. Seitaro covered his teapot carefully with a cloth to keep it warm. The cat moved near his bag and began sniffing around it with curiosity. The cat then looked up at him with an expression that seemed to be asking him to play and engage with it. In his mind, Seitaro imagined the possibility that the cat had been chased by a monster somewhere in the dungeon and had subsequently gotten lost and confused about where it was. Seitaro turned to the cat and offered to accompany it and make sure it got back home safely. The cat meowed back in what appeared to be an agreeable response to this kind offer. Later on, the two of them ventured and traveled deeper and further inside the dungeon together. They went from underground level 4 down to underground level 5, and then further still to underground level 6 as they progressed deeper. Seitaro cast a protective barrier spell around both of them to keep them safe from harm. He announced quietly that they would sleep out there for the night, then closed his eyes and drifted off into sleep peacefully. The cat twitched with alertness and then stood up from its resting position, its gaze fixed and locked onto the surrounding darkness with intense focus and attention. Somewhere within the shadows nearby, something rustled and moved. The presence of whatever it was continued, drawing closer and closer to where they rested. Two men emerged from the darkness with menacing grins spread across their faces. As they stepped toward the sleeping old man and the cat, one of the men sneered with contempt, expressing disbelief that there was just an old man sitting there by himself without any companions or protection. The other man added that he must have wandered away from his group or been left behind by them. The cat meowed with obvious panic and alarm at the danger approaching them. One of the men drew his weapon and slammed it forcefully against the barrier that Seitaro had cast around them. He mocked the old man, suggesting that he must have thought the barrier would be enough to keep him safe from harm, but declared that it was too bad for him. The other man added that the barrier was no match at all for their magic blades and special weapons. The cat trembled with panic and distress at the sight of the barrier being attacked. The man continued hitting and striking the barrier repeatedly with force until it finally shattered and broke apart completely. Without any second thought or hesitation, the two men stepped inside the broken barrier. One of the men remarked with surprise that the old man was still sleeping through all of this noise and destruction. The cat turned to look at Seitaro with a panicked and desperate expression, urging him to wake up and react. As the two men drew even closer to the sleeping figure, one of them said that the old man was a lucky person. The other added that he would get to die peacefully while still in his sleep without even knowing what was happening. Meanwhile, the cat peeked outside the broken barrier with wide eyes, squeezing them tightly shut as its whole body trembled with fear and uncertainty. Then, with a sudden and newfound resolve and determination rising within it, the cat opened its eyes again and stepped forward bravely, letting out an angry and defiant meow directed at the two threatening men. One of the men sneered with cold amusement that the old man had died in his sleep and without any pain. The other man chuckled in response. The cat looked around in panic and distress, pressing itself close to the sleeping Seitaro and holding on to him. It closed its eyes and shook with fear, then opened them again with a serious and determined expression on its face. Stepping forward with courage, it hissed at the two men in warning and defiance. The man scoffed with dismissal, questioning whether this was the old man's cat and treating it as nothing worth worrying about. The other man asked what they should do about it. The first man grinned and suggested that they could skin it and sell the fur for money. The cat froze completely in place, continuing to hiss at them. The man suddenly paused and gasped in alarm and confusion. Vines had wrapped themselves around his foot without any warning. The man panicked and shouted at his companion, demanding to know what he was doing and calling him an idiot. The other man replied with confusion that he had no idea what was happening either, and that all of a sudden his legs were being affected as well. Holding his wand calmly and with quiet focus, Seitaro cast his spells for paralysis and silence simultaneously. In an instant, both men lost their voices completely and froze in place without being able to move. The cat leapt toward them with a loud and triumphant meow. Just then, lightning struck the two men from above. The vines continued to wrap and wind themselves tightly around their bodies, securing them completely. The cat turned around and meowed in Seitaro's direction. Seitaro looked at the cat and patted its head gently, expressing his thanks and gratitude for the cat's brave attempt to protect him. Seitaro muttered quietly to himself, wondering aloud whether these two were street robbers by profession or simply opportunistic hooligans who had spotted what they thought was an easy target. He asked them directly which it was. One of the men gritted his teeth and replied that who could know the answer to that. The cat called out to Seitaro to draw his attention to something nearby. Seitaro picked up a slab of wood and muttered that it was solid and useful evidence as he opened a bag to reveal a pile of stolen goods hidden inside it. He concluded from this discovery that the two men were indeed robbers. The man shouted in frustrated vindication, demanding to know what kind of ordinary old man used a barrier spell just to rest and sleep in a dungeon. The other man told him to shut up and pointed out that it was far too late for that kind of complaint now. Seitaro scratched his face thoughtfully, considering what to do with the situation they were now in. He fell silent as he thought deeply about the options available to him. Then he said that dealing with them further could cause more trouble than it was worth, and decided he would simply leave them there tied up. The robbers shouted in outrage at this decision, protesting that he could not be so heartlessly cruel to them. After a moment of consideration and work, a slab of wood hung around one of the robbers' necks with a written sign attached to it that explained he was a robber who had been subdued by someone he had tried to rob. Seitaro began walking away, leaving them tied up and helpless behind him. He told them that the barrier he had cast should hold and remain in place until they reached the exit. He instructed them to make sure to turn themselves in to the proper authorities when they got there. Then he continued on with his journey deeper into the dungeon without looking back. Seitaro looked upward and then sat himself down comfortably in front of a door with his tea set arranged and ready beside him. Just then, he glanced toward the direction of some approaching voices that were getting closer. A group of people arrived at his location, with someone among them expressing excitement at having finally reached this point and asking whether they wanted to go all the way to the end. Someone else in the group called for the others to wait and pointed out that there was already someone sitting there. One of the men greeted Seitaro in a casual manner. Another from the group asked whether he was waiting there for someone specific and whether the people he was with were inside the dungeon ahead. Seitaro replied that no, he was there alone and by himself. A woman in the group squealed with delight and hugged the cat that was with Seitaro tightly, exclaiming over how cute it was. One of the men informed Seitaro that the next room ahead contained a mid-level boss monster. Seitaro replied that he was already aware of this fact. He then added that they seemed to be a lively and energetic group of people. Seitaro thought quietly to himself that, well, he could simply rest there for a little bit longer before proceeding. One of the men called out to get his attention in a somewhat disrespectful and dismissive tone. Another from the group said that they were actually in somewhat of a hurry. Seitaro muttered in mild surprise at this. The man added impatiently that surely Seitaro could see they were in a rush. Seitaro waved at them agreeably and said that, well then, he supposed he would be on his way and get moving. One of the girls told him to read the situation and the room properly, asking whether he could simply let them go ahead of him instead of making them wait. Seitaro replied that he understood and stepped aside. One of the men then mocked him, asking sarcastically how he had even managed to get this deep in the dungeon, suggesting he must have done so by running away from every danger he encountered. Another added insultingly that he did not appear to have a single piece of loot or treasure to show for his time in the dungeon. Seitaro replied calmly that everything he had collected was stored inside his inventory system. The man's eyes widened in surprise and interest at hearing this. A wide and calculating smirk formed on his lips at the realization. He exclaimed about the inventory with obvious greed, then turned to his companions and suggested that this grandfather clearly needed their help and assistance. The woman in the group asked what their leader was doing and what he was planning. The leader replied with false warmth and friendliness, suggesting they all lend the old man their strength and work together. The men in the group cheered at this proposal with enthusiasm. Seitaro responded that he was actually perfectly fine on his own, but then reflected briefly that, well, travel was after all about the companions one found along the way and such things. The leader agreed enthusiastically with this sentiment, declaring that they should all help each other out. The men cheered again in agreement. Afterward, and shortly after entering the boss room together, Seitaro instantly and effortlessly took down the boss monster without any apparent difficulty or struggle. The entire party was left stunned and frozen in shock at what had just happened before their eyes. Seitaro stood completely still and calm as the thick smoke from the battle slowly dispersed and cleared away around him. The leader praised him with genuine amazement, calling him amazing and admitting awkwardly that he could have mentioned beforehand that he was such a powerful and skilled wizard. He noted that he had never seen that particular boss defeated so quickly before, and observed that the amount of loot left behind was enormous and far too much for their designated haulers to carry on their own. The leader then asked whether Seitaro would be willing to store the excess loot inside his inventory for them. Seitaro agreed that this was fine and acceptable. The leader offered in return that they would handle and submit the subjugation report on his behalf. Seitaro muttered with sudden recognition that they had haulers with them, then paused as he realized something about who these people actually were and where he had encountered them before. One of the men addressed Seitaro directly with a pleading tone, begging him not to reveal their past behavior to others, because if people found out they had been placing blame on innocent people, they would not even be able to continue living and working in that area. Seitaro replied with calm acceptance that, well, it seemed like they were making an honest living now, and that was good enough reason to let the matter go. The man fell silent with relief at this response. Later on, when he had returned from the dungeon, Seitaro went back to the inn and sat quietly and alone in the bathtub, letting out a long sigh and muttering to himself that a good bath really brought him back to life and restored his energy. Just then, loud and heavy footsteps echoed through the building getting closer. A voice shouted out loudly, demanding to know where Seitaro was. Not long after, Gould burst through the door inside the bathroom, shouting that this was not the time to be relaxing in a bath given the situation. Seitaro replied calmly that, oh, it was Gould who had come to find him. A few moments later, the two of them had both settled into the bathtub together. When he had finished bathing, Seitaro let out a satisfied and contented sigh, commenting that it had been a good bath and addressing Gould by name. As they settled and sat around the table afterward, Seitaro asked Gould in a calm and casual manner what it was he had needed to tell him and why he had come with such urgency. Gould snapped back to the reason for his visit, remembering with sudden urgency. He explained with irritation that a group of people had been taking all the credit for what had happened inside the wood dungeon, claiming that they had been the ones battling the monsters and doing all the work. Seitaro replied calmly that he understood and acknowledged this information. Gould added further that the group had also claimed that Seitaro had been the one being attacked and in danger, and that they had been the ones to save him from harm. He asked directly whether this version of events was actually true. Seitaro smiled and said that, well, that was the story they were going with then, and that it was all right and fine by him, since he was just a merchant after all. He thanked Gould for coming and informing him of what was being said. Gould scowled and told him that he was being far too kind and generous about the whole matter. He urged and encouraged Seitaro to register with the Adventurers Guild already and establish a proper official identity. Seitaro replied that he had not known about or considered that option before. Gould then told him that anyway, it was not a good or acceptable thing for people to be slaying dungeon bosses so casually and without proper procedure and authorization. Seitaro gave him a puzzled and questioning look at this statement. Gould explained with slight annoyance that doing so disrupted and upset the monster ecosystem inside the dungeon and could cause a whole range of serious problems and trouble. He pointed out that Seitaro going in and acting without restraint was part of the problem. Seitaro replied simply that that was troublesome to hear. Gould shouted back that it was his problem as well and not just everyone else's concern. Afterward, the two of them fell asleep for the night. The following morning, the guards greeted Seitaro warmly as he arrived, wishing him a good morning. Seitaro returned the greeting and commented that it was great and pleasant weather that day. As soon as he entered the building he was heading to, he was met with a large crowd of people and the lively sound of chatter filling the space. A staff member handed him a numbered card, explaining that it was his number and that he could join the line and wait his turn. Seitaro thanked them politely and stepped into the waiting line. Just then, a man approached him with recognition and surprise, calling his name and asking what he was doing standing in a regular line like an ordinary visitor. Seitaro began to explain himself with some mild uncertainty. The man told him firmly that he was a special guest and did not need a number or to wait in any line. The crowd standing behind them wondered among themselves about who this person was, expressing curiosity and admiration. The man added that Seitaro should come with him right away. The people around them murmured again in confusion about what was happening and who warranted this kind of special treatment. Seitaro replied politely that it was kind and generous of the man to offer, but that it was important to follow the proper order of things and respect the system. He said he would simply wait in line like everyone else, smiling as he said it. The people who had been on the verge of disagreeing and expressing frustration with jumping the queue nodded in agreement with Seitaro's principled response. Meanwhile, in the crowd nearby, various people were talking among themselves about who Seitaro was. One man asked another whether he knew who Seitaro was. The other confirmed that of course he knew him and described him as very easygoing and approachable. Someone else added that Seitaro had once brought him a drink as a kind gesture after beating him in a tasting competition. The man said that Seitaro had a good eye and refined sense for quality products. A woman smiled and mentioned that Seitaro had taught her a recipe that she valued. Someone exclaimed about the donuts he was known for making. The party leader from the dungeon spoke up with confidence, claiming familiarity with Seitaro and describing him as the old man with the impressive inventory. He offered to introduce a nearby attractive woman to him, pointing out boldly that they were fellow adventurers and adding a flattering comment about her appearance. After a moment of silence, a mysterious woman nearby whispered her assessment that he was shameless and forward in his behavior. The staff announced the next number being called, which was number 56. Seitaro responded quickly and cheerfully that he was there and ready. Meanwhile, in a darker corner of the scene, the face of the maid from before darkened with cold and threatening intent, muttering to herself that no matter how much Seitaro pretended to be a good and decent man, his time was coming to an end. Inside the private room where his meeting took place, Adi gasped in amazement at the materials Seitaro had brought, expressing disbelief that such rare items had come from the wood dungeon. Seitaro told her calmly that this was not even all of what he had collected, and that there was more beyond what she was seeing. Adi asked whether he had any interest in having these rare materials processed and refined before selling them, rather than selling them in their raw state. Seitaro muttered in genuine curiosity and interest at this idea, asking whether she could tell him more about what processing involved and what could be done with the materials. The cat sitting quietly nearby watched the two of them with silent attention, its eyes sparkling with bright curiosity at the conversation taking place. At the very same time, in another place entirely, Israel asked with a sigh whether the little girl was still watching and observing from where she stood. He told her with some firmness that if she was not going to come along willingly, he would have no choice but to leave her behind in that place. The little girl quickly turned to face him at this statement. She grabbed hold of his clothing with her small hands in a gesture of desperation and reluctance. Israel patted her head gently and asked her with calm concern what the matter was and what was troubling her. The little girl replied with honesty and sadness that she did not want to go and leave where she currently was. Adi explained to Seitaro that processing could naturally mean many different things depending on what one was working with. Seitaro agreed, noting that it was much the same with tea leaves. AD recommended that he leave the actual processing work to a professional. Calf nodded in agreement. AD added that in that case, the important thing would be figuring out what kind of processing would best bring out the value of the material in question. Seitaro murmured that he understood. It all came down to knowing the customer. While they were talking, the cat had climbed up onto the table and was peering around with curiosity. Calf quickly reached over and caught it. Seitaro turned and apologized for the interruption. Calf asked whether the cat belonged to him. Seitaro said it was not his pet. Calf and AD both went quiet at that. Seitaro smiled and said it was his friend. The cat looked up at him and meowed, and the sound stirred something deep in his memory. A familiar meow from another cat long ago. He remembered Takumi as a small child, clutching a cat and calling out to him. The memory settled warmly in his chest. He thought to himself that it reminded him of when their cat Tama had been a kitten, and Takumi had been just as small at the time. Another memory rose at the sight of freshly cut logs nearby. Takumi, sitting on his lap as a young boy. Seitaro smiled at the image. He recalled how much the boy had loved his tea canisters, playing with them and shouting out as though they were parts of a toy that could be combined. The memory made him smile again and prompted a thought. Perhaps he would make tea canisters out of this wood. AD asked what he meant by tea canisters, suggesting that if he meant a case of some kind, she could introduce him to a woodworker or a metalworker. Seitaro said his tea canisters were a little different from what she might be picturing, and that all he needed was a wooden board to make one. AD gasped with excitement at the idea of producing a tea canister from a single board and immediately said it sounded like a profitable venture and asked him to tell them more. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. A woman burst in through the door and called out to AD. AD asked in surprise what Polonia was doing there. Polonia replied that she had heard the guild was receiving a shipment of rare wood. Seitaro watched with mild puzzlement. Polonia immediately stared at the wood and reacted with barely contained excitement, unable to understand how resources this rare could have come from such a low-level dungeon. AD quickly told her not to touch it. Polonia pushed back, asking whether she could at least check the hardness. Seitaro hesitated, and in that moment Polonia exclaimed that the wood was the trunk of a giant spirit tree. AD scolded her for barging in without warning. Polonia was too engrossed to slow down, pointing out the tightness of the grain and the complete absence of any gaps in it, explaining that a tree growing in those conditions had been in an exceptionally good environment. Seitaro listened to her assessment with quiet and serious attention. AD asked her sharply what her point was. Calf shrank back nervously. Polonia said she was pointing out that this was extraordinarily rare wood. AD told her that her habit of doing this, bursting in without notice, no matter how exceptional her knowledge was exactly why she had never managed to build a steady stream of work. She told Polonia to send word ahead before arriving next time. Polonia declared that what AD was telling her was completely beside the point, given how rarely one ever got to encounter something like this. Seitaro glanced downward, and his eyes landed on an axe nearby. Calf leaned close and quietly apologized on behalf of the two women, telling Seitaro that once they got going like this, it could carry on for quite some time. He explained that the two of them were childhood friends and did genuinely get along, even when they sounded like that. He suggested that Seitaro might want to go ahead to the shop next door and have some coffee while he waited for things to settle down. Just then someone called out to him. A group approached, led by someone who thanked Seitaro for his work in the wood dungeon the day before. A woman in the group exclaimed that it was the grandpa with the cat. Seitaro recognized them and murmured that they were the ones he had met before. The leader asked whether Seitaro would like to join them for another excursion into the dungeon, adding that with his inventory, he was always more than welcome. Seitaro remarked that they had only just gone the day before and noted that they were certainly hard workers. Calf asked quietly whether Seitaro knew these people. The leader laughed and explained that normally after making as much as they had, they would celebrate for at least a month, but this time was different. He said they had defeated the boss, which had caused stronger bosses with rarer resource drops to begin spawning in the dungeon. Seitaro said he understood, thinking privately that it sounded rather like an imbalance in the ecosystem. He told the group he would sit this one out, as he was in the middle of trying his hand at some business matters. The cat had found a high vantage point and was watching everything in silence below. A woman in the group jolted toward it with delight. The leader continued, saying he would share some information for free. They were fellow adventurers after all. He pulled something from his pocket with a slight grin, describing it as something that emitted a smoke capable of drawing monsters in, and that used in a specific way, it could even lure monsters out from inside the dungeon. Seitaro's expression became serious at that. He sighed and told the leader he was in the middle of an important business conversation. The leader smiled and said that was a shame, but before the group departed, he called back that they were planning on going in again the following day, and that if Seitaro finished his errands, he was welcome to come along. Seitaro waved them off and told them to be careful out there. After the group had gone, Calf remarked quietly that the situation was a little concerning, especially given that the monsters now spawning were significantly stronger than before. Seitaro replied that those young people surely understood that their lives were the most important thing, and that they would probably be all right. The cat let out a loud meow beside him. A little while later, they finally arrived at their destination and settled around table. Calf sighed with contentment and said that it had been exactly what he needed. Seitaro asked what Polonia actually was, what her background and skills were. Calf explained that despite her young age, she was a master crafts worker who had grown up in the same town as Adi and himself. He added that her specialty was woodworking and asked Seitaro what he thought about the idea of asking Polonia to make the tea canister cases. Seitaro said he appreciated the suggestion, but that the craftsmanship involved in making the canisters was tedious work that required both physical strength and considerable perseverance. He did not think it was suited to someone so young. All of a sudden, Calf slammed his hand on the table and rose to his feet. Then he bowed deeply and urgently. He asked Seitaro to please give the girl a chance. He explained that Polonia was genuinely talented at what she did, but that her personality could put people off, which meant she did not get much work despite her ability. She was proud and could come across as difficult, he admitted, but she was a good person underneath it all. He suggested it could be treated as a trial run, and that if things did not work out, she would take full responsibility for it. Seitaro smiled and agreed readily, telling Calf to please stop bowing and that he would give the girl the job. Calf straightened up with clear relief and immediately bowed again in gratitude. Seitaro told him firmly, no more bowing. The cat sat quietly nearby and watched the whole exchange. Seitaro smiled warmly. After some time had passed, Calf found himself staring at a finished tea canister in complete amazement. He had assumed Seitaro would simply hollow out a piece of wood, but the grain ran continuously all the way around the body of the canister, meaning it had originally been a single flat wooden board bent into shape. He slid his hand along the surface and then marveled further at the lid, which fit perfectly and was also made entirely of wood. He said it was the most incredible thing he had ever seen, and that without knowing better, he would have assumed magic was involved. Seitaro chuckled and told him he was being far too dramatic. It was simply a technique that worked with the natural properties of wood. They sat quietly for a moment. Calf then asked whether Seitaro was really saying he would teach them this technique. Seitaro confirmed that had always been the plan. Calf muttered that it was perfect timing, because at that very moment, the familiar voice of Adi arrived, along with Polonia. Adi said she had something she wanted to discuss with Seitaro, but that first she wanted to give him their estimates for the resources from the earlier transaction. Calf jumped in and told Adi that regarding the matter of the tea canisters, Seitaro had said he was willing to give Polonia a chance. Polonia flinched visibly at that and spun around quickly to face them. Seitaro smiled and told her to take a look at the finished canister first, and if she believed she could make one, the job was hers. Polonia stared at it with intense focus, murmuring quietly to herself. Seitaro told them it was a technique from his homeland. The cat had taken up a position above them and watched everything below with silent attention. Elsewhere, Israel was watching through a mirror and remarked that it looked as though Seitaro had found himself yet another interesting endeavor. The scene in the mirror showed the carriage moving along, and then shifted to Seitaro patiently instructing Polonia on how to boil the wood and bend it, carefully teaching her the steps of the craft. The little girl who was watching with Israel smiled and said that Seitaro looked like he was having fun. Israel corrected her gently, saying she should call him Seitaro and not by any other name. The little girl immediately said no. Meanwhile, at the wood dungeon, a massive explosion erupted. The dungeon filled with roaring, shouting, the thunder of heavy footsteps, and deep rumbling sounds. One of the men cried out that this was not what they had agreed to when they planned this. A massive monster was roaring and giving chase. One man lay wounded on the ground, cursing under his breath. A woman gasped, unable to believe what was happening. None of this had been mentioned to them. Another man demanded to know what the leader planned to do, insisting they were finished. But the leader himself was in a state of panic and had not yet formed any plan. Without waiting for orders, several members of the group turned and ran, abandoning their leader. He called after them desperately, reminding them that they were comrades and begging them not to leave him behind. He tried to run after them and ordered them to stop. Then suddenly one of the fleeing members shouted for everyone to halt. A large monster had appeared directly in front of them, cutting off their escape. At the headquarters of the Adventurers Guild, a man came bursting in, gasping as he reported that monsters were flooding out of the dungeon. A high-level party was currently trying to hold them back, but if the situation was not brought under control, the monsters would overrun the entire city. A calm voice replied that it was already known. Gould gave orders to begin evacuating all the residents as a precaution. The man reported that monsters were already emerging onto the surface. Gould told everyone there was no need to panic yet. He mentioned that word had come in that one of the young adventurers had brought a strange item into the dungeon, and the implication was clear. That individual had likely triggered the situation. Outside, residents began to move away from the danger. Gould gathered those around him and told them to give everything they had in this fight. Jilk directed the guard to leave certain troops stationed within the city, pointing out that without reserve forces their options would be severely limited. Then a calm voice cut through the tension. Seitaro had arrived and observed that it looked like they were preparing for something significant. Gould reacted with startled surprise, demanding to know what Seitaro was doing there and telling the young lady with him to get somewhere safe immediately. Seitaro said he understood the situation and smiled, saying that they would go ahead and evacuate. But he told Gould to make sure he took care of himself. Gould managed only a short and flustered response. Gould noted afterward that the old man was surprisingly easy to deal with in a crisis. Without wasting any time, Seitaro and the girl headed toward the wood dungeon. Insects twitched and stirred in the undergrowth as soldiers advanced toward the entrance. Gould called out to his people, telling them their first priority was not to kill everything, but to drive the monsters back underground. Jilk stopped in his tracks. A man came running toward them, shouting for help and describing huge trees and insects appearing out of nowhere. Jilk told the man to calm down and asked whether there were others still inside. At the same moment, behind a tree nearby, a man gasped as he realized he had managed to get out. He glanced toward the sound of approaching footsteps and saw a small girl walking in the open. Then a monster emerged from behind her. The man stared in stunned horror, then clenched his fist. Without hesitating for even a moment, he sprinted toward her. The monster turned its attention to him and swung one of its massive legs. The man threw himself forward at the last possible second, grabbing the girl and rolling out of the way. He braced himself, convinced he was finished. But nothing happened. The monster wobbled heavily, then crashed to the ground with a tremendous thud. Seitaro smiled quietly and said that it seemed the young man had done well. The man lay there in complete shock. The little girl's face broke into a bright and relieved smile. The guards moved quickly to get the residents to safety, calling out to reassure people as they went. Inside the shrine, the atmosphere was unsettled and full of anxious chatter. Polonia, 80, and Calf had gathered around a table. Calf kept glancing at the commotion unfolding nearby, where a man was raising his voice and demanding to know who was responsible for what was happening. A priest tried without much success to calm him down. Behind them, a group of children huddled together in fear, one small girl expressing aloud that she was scared. 80 observed the scene with visible disapproval. Calf got up from the table and went over to the children, speaking to them in a gentle and reassuring tone and guiding them along with him. One of the girls recognized him as the commerce man. Another asked tearfully whether they could not go home anymore. 80 stepped in and told the children everything would be fine, suggesting they play while they waited. Calf was quietly impressed when he noticed the children already had toy blocks to occupy themselves with, and wondered aloud where they had come from. Polonia laughed and clarified that she had not come prepared with toys. She had simply made the blocks herself using pieces of a broken chair nearby. Calf was taken aback at this, genuinely surprised she was capable of something like that. Polonia shrugged it off, saying it was nothing compared to what her grandfather usually asked of her. She then realized she had not seen the old man and asked where he was. 80 suddenly remembered the same thing, and both of them registered with some alarm that Seitaro was nowhere to be found. In the wood dungeon, the situation was already serious. Monsters were coming in relentless waves, and the fighting showed no sign of stopping. Gould pushed through them with everything he had, while more creatures lurked unseen in the surrounding shadows, waiting. Jill called out to Gould, and Gould acknowledged that things had gotten completely out of hand. There was simply no end to the monsters. Then a familiar voice broke through the chaos, expressing casual surprise at running into them there. Gould was stunned to see Seitaro and immediately told him the situation was dangerous and demanded to know what he was doing there. Seitaro said he had come back to retrieve something he had left behind and asked whether this kind of monster assault happened often. Gould said absolutely not. Even the normally docile creatures of the dungeon had turned aggressive, and nothing like this had ever occurred before in his experience. Seitaro acknowledged that it was a difficult situation and asked whether they had any idea what was causing it. High up in the trees above them, hidden from view, a woman in a maid's uniform was watching everything unfold below. She observed the guards struggling to hold back the constant assault and watched Gould cut down monsters with sharp, efficient strikes, while Seitaro moved among the wounded to tend to them. She studied Seitaro's labored movements and thought coldly that he was running out of breath and that he should just hurry up and die. A man's face flashed briefly through her mind, and she reflected that while he had been foolish, he had served his purpose well enough. She continued watching in silence, her attention sharpening suddenly when Seitaro crouched down and began drawing something on the ground. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. The realization of what he might be doing unsettled her. Seitaro spoke quietly, indicating that there had to be something at a specific location. Joke heard him and began to put the same idea together. Gould immediately stood and called out to everyone around him, announcing that they believed they had found a way through and that they were close. He told the group firmly to stay together and to protect Seitaro at all costs. At that moment, a branch snapped above them. Gould's voice shot out immediately, ordering everyone not to give chase. The guards fanned out in all directions and held the line against the monsters, focusing on keeping them back rather than pursuing whatever had caused the sound. One of the guards confirmed the order. Seitaro noted that the situation seemed to be turning in their favor. A little girl who had been watching from nearby was visibly amazed by everything happening around her. Sometime later, Gould called out that they had arrived at the location Seitaro had identified. Seitaro's expression became serious as he assessed what surrounded them. Monsters had closed in on all sides. Jilk asked what the plan was. Seitaro kept looking around carefully, searching until something caught his eye. He found it. He cast 2 spells in quick succession, Bind and Barrier. The effect was immediate. The guards reacted with relief and amazement as the monsters were stopped in their tracks and then scattered, retreating into the shadows of the forest. Silence settled over the wood. Gould caught his breath, genuinely surprised at what had been causing the problem. The little girl who had been watching drifted closer to the strange object that had drawn the monsters, her curiosity getting the better of her. Jilk gently warned her to keep her distance. She asked what it was. Seitaro knelt down with a slight frown and activated his appraisal ability to examine it more closely. He turned to the little girl, who was waiting with bright and eager eyes, and told her that he knew who this belonged to. Up in the tree, the maid clenched her jaw. As she prepared to slip away, quietly, a voice called up to her. The party leader had spotted her and accused her of being responsible for everything that had happened, demanding to know whether she intended to take responsibility for it. The maid turned to face them. Her eyes were flat and dark. She smiled pleasantly and offered an apology along with a small stone as compensation for their trouble. The group stared at the stone with confused expressions. The leader was not satisfied, making clear that a small stone hardly seemed like adequate compensation. Without warning, an explosion went off around them. The group reacted in shock, and in the chaos and thick smoke, the maid slipped away. When the smoke cleared, one of the men allowed himself a smug moment, satisfied that she had been frightened off. But the woman among them had noticed something about the stone. Before she could finish her thought, it slipped from her grip and shattered on the ground. She cried out in alarm. The leader shouted at her for breaking it. Before anyone could piece together what that meant, monsters began emerging from behind them. The situation had taken a sharp and dangerous turn. Back in the dungeon, Jilk's attention snapped to a sound in the distance. He asked Gould whether he had heard it. Gould said it was probably his imagination, but then shifted the conversation, telling Seitaro there was something he had been wanting to ask. Seitaro asked what it was. Gould nodded toward the little girl and asked whether she was Seitaro's granddaughter. A brief silence followed. Seitaro shook his head and said she was not. Jilk concluded from this that she must be lost. At that moment, the little girl tugged at Seitaro's sleeve and called him Grandpa with an open and cheerful smile. Seitaro looked at her with a puzzled expression. Then he paused, tilting his head slightly. He had heard something in the distance. He said quietly that he thought he had heard it too. Gould dismissed what Seitaro had heard as the old man imagining things, but Seitaro was certain he had heard something real. Deep in the forest, not far from them, screams were indeed filling the air, though they went unaddressed for the moment. Later that night, back at the inn, Seitaro and the child were both sleeping peacefully when a voice began calling to him, cutting through the quiet and reaching him in a way that felt deeper than ordinary sound. Seitaro sat up quickly. The being addressing him identified himself as Israel, explaining that he was speaking directly to Seitaro's soul and had come with a request. Seitaro covered his eyes against the intense light emanating from the figure, recognizing who it was and asking what he needed at that hour of the night, and also making a pointed request for the halo to be dimmed before it disturbed anyone nearby. Israel obliged, and then laid out his request. He was asking Seitaro to take the child into his care. He acknowledged it was a long story, but began to explain. He told Seitaro that the world was home to more than just human societies. There were communities made up entirely of demons, and this child had been born into one of them. She was the daughter of a king, and her society had been a good and peaceful one until a coup carried out by those with dangerous and misguided ambitions had tore it apart. Israel believed this coup was only the first step in a larger effort toward world domination. He had managed to save the child, but he explained that if he continued to involve himself directly in these affairs, he would upset the delicate balance of the world itself. That was why he was bringing the child to Seitaro. Seitaro glanced at the sleeping child and turned the situation over carefully in his mind. He trusted Israel. The being had never lied to him or twisted facts, and yet he had the distinct feeling that the full picture had not been shared with him. A quiet settled over the room as he sat in thought. Then the cat meowed, and Seitaro looked at it for a moment. He let out a long breath and agreed. Israel's expression immediately lifted with relief and gratitude. Seitaro stopped him before he could express it further, noting that he had not yet heard the condition Seitaro intended to attach to his agreement. Israel waited. The cat, apparently quite pleased with developments, trotted into the room and curled up beside the sleeping child. When the little girl woke fully, she lit up at the sight of both Seitaro and Israel and greeted them with bright delight. Both of them smiled warmly back at her. She got up and moved around the room with the easy energy of a child who felt entirely safe. Seitaro reflected quietly on the weight of what had just been revealed to him, that this small, cheerful child carried such a significant and hidden past. Israel smiled beside him. The little girl called out to Seitaro happily as she played, and he returned the gesture with a wave. He sat still, watching her, and found himself thinking that none of it showed on her. Israel said that despite everything, things would be all right now that Seitaro had chosen to take her in. Seitaro remained quiet. The soft sound of a pot broke the silence. Seitaro then raised a practical concern. What if someone were to use the child for their own purposes, or if he himself were to simply leave her behind somewhere in the course of his travels? Israel glanced at the tea being poured and asked silently if he might have some, then murmured that it was better than expected. He then responded to Seitaro's question directly, telling him he had no concerns about either possibility because he knew Seitaro was not capable of doing either of those things. Seitaro's eyes widened slightly at this. He recognized that Israel had seen through him completely. The little girl called out for him again from across the room. Seitaro then asked what her name was. A moment of quiet followed. Israel told him that she had expressed a wish for Seitaro to be the one to name her. The scene shifted with the sound of a loud and frustrated groan. Polonia was at her work, clearly at her limit, having tried over and over to produce something to no success. She pulled back a blanket to reveal a shelf crowded with her failed attempts. She picked up a canister and stared at it, gritting her teeth and trying to understand what she was doing wrong. Seitaro watched her with a thoughtful expression, privately noting that what she was attempting was difficult even for someone experienced, let alone for a first effort. He offered gently to help her if she would like. Polonia spun toward him, and the offer immediately triggered a complicated mixture of feelings. Pride made her reluctant to ask for help so soon. She voiced her concern that if she accepted assistance, others would use it as an excuse to say women were not suited for the work. She clenched her fist as she said it, clearly speaking from accumulated experience rather than a passing fear. Seitaro acknowledged that she had been through a great deal. He told her there was no shame in learning from others, and continued with a few more words of quiet encouragement. Polonia's expression gradually steadied. She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, the resolve in her face was clear. She agreed to accept his help. Seitaro expressed quiet approval. Polonia raised her hand before they began, hesitating slightly before bringing up the matter of resources. The workshop did not have much money, and she was asking whether he might be able to provide a little more in the way of materials. Seitaro agreed without any hesitation, asking what she needed and how much. Polonia fumbled for a moment, embarrassed to specify, and before she could fully get the words out, new materials appeared directly in front of her. She jumped with delight at the sight of them. Seitaro mentioned that the Commerce Guild could be asked to purchase whatever additional wood was still needed. The two of them went to the guild afterward. Adi thanked Seitaro warmly, as she always did. Kaf mentioned that the finest grade of wood would be released onto the market gradually rather than all at once. Seitaro was puzzled by this approach. Kaf explained the reasoning. Flooding the market with a large quantity of a rare resource all at once would drive the price down sharply. Adi elaborated, pointing out that this was a particular danger for merchants who dealt in high-quality wood. If their stock suddenly lost its value, they could go bankrupt. While the influx of rare material would not last forever and prices would eventually recover, the merchants who had already gone under in the interim would have no way of getting back into the business. Kaf summed it up by saying that protecting the market was simply part of the guild's responsibility, and that meant controlling how much of a product circulated at any given time, even if it meant accepting less profit in the short term. The little girl listened with a furrowed brow, clearly not following the details of the conversation. Seitaro nodded, telling them he understood. Adi added that the merchants they worked with were honest people who deserved to be treated with proper respect. She noted that the calculus was different for products that no one else offered, but that items like that were rare. Seitaro said suddenly that he happened to have something of that nature. Kaf and Adi both reacted with sharp surprise, asking what he meant. Seitaro told them with a quiet grin that he had seen it in the dungeon, before all the chaos had broken out. The two of them stared at him in stunned disbelief, while the little girl watched the whole exchange with wide and baffled eyes, entirely unsure what the adults around her were so excited about. Inside the Commerce Guild, Adi and Kaf reacted with open shock at what Seitaro had told them. The little girl looked around with curious eyes, sensing the adults around her were excited about something, but not quite understanding what. Seitaro patted her head gently. Adi summarized what she had heard with barely contained excitement. Seitaro was telling them there was a resource hidden in the wood dungeon that none of them had ever encountered before. Seitaro confirmed it with a smile, and suggested the easiest thing would be to simply show them. He handed them a written list, and asked them to gather all the equipment noted on it. Adi confirmed everything on the list was available in the guild storehouse. The little girl immediately announced she wanted to help find everything, and Seitaro smiled warmly at her enthusiasm. They made their way to the storehouse, and the search began. Kaf located one of the items, a bowl that had been acquired from somewhere in the east, and the little girl's eyes lit up at the sight of it. Once everything on the list had been gathered, the others waited expectantly, asking what Seitaro intended to do with it all. He began to cook. Adi stared at the pancakes, taking shape in front of her with complete bewilderment. Seitaro then produced a bottle and held it up, asking whether they knew what it was. Kaf looked at it with a puzzled expression, describing it as colored water. Seitaro opened it and poured the liquid over the pancakes in a careful and deliberate way. The little girl watched with sparkling eyes. Adi asked whether it was honey. Kaf inhaled and was immediately taken aback by the smell, something sweet and entirely unfamiliar. The little girl took a bite without hesitation, and her face said everything. Kaf tried it next and was equally stunned, recognizing with disbelief that what he was tasting had come from the tree sap that everyone had always thrown away without a second thought. Adi declared it delicious and could barely contain her astonishment at the idea that something they had been discarding all along could have been a valuable resource. The little girl tugged at Seitaro and asked for more. He laughed softly, glad she liked it, and told her there were still some leftovers at the inn. Kaf noted that sweet things had always been expensive, and that people would be very happy indeed. Seitaro smiled and let a quiet memory pass through him. He recalled that things had been the same way when he was young. A brief silence settled over the group before 80 asked about the second new product Seitaro had mentioned. He replied that they had not noticed it yet, and told them it was already right in front of them. It was the plate the pancakes were sitting on. 80 and Calf both looked down at the bowl with renewed attention. 80 picked it up and murmured that she had not paid much attention to its finish before. Calf explained that it was a piece that had been brought back by a guild master several generations ago during his travels, and had simply been sitting in storage as a sample ever since. 80 noted it was quite old. Calf added that despite its age and the long journey it had made, it was barely marked or damaged. 80 admired its grain, struck by how beautiful it was for something so tough. Seitaro then told them what the bowl was made from, a lacquer derived from a different type of tree sap. In his homeland, they called it urushi lacquer. Both Calf and 80 drew a sharp breath, deeply impressed, and 80 began to piece together what Seitaro was implying. He confirmed it with a smile. He could teach them the entire process. He noted that with urushi lacquer, the base coating was just as important as anything that came after it. While he was explaining, the little girl made her request for more food known again. Seitaro gave her a gentle and fond look, patted her head, and told her to be patient. Calf expressed deep gratitude and asked what Seitaro planned to do next. Seitaro said he was thinking of heading back into the dungeon to collect more samples of the tree sap. As they parted outside the store, Calf called out his farewell and reminded them of the same time the following day. The little girl bowed politely and thanked them, then turned and called out to Seitaro as they walked. A moment later, a child's excited voice nearby caught the little girl's attention. Another girl was walking with her parents and had spotted a cat. The little girl turned toward the voice with interest. Seitaro noticed a familiar face in the small family and greeted them. It was Jilk, who explained that he happened to be off duty that day, and then introduced his wife and daughter. The little girl gave her name to the new girl with a bright smile, Nina. Seitaro said warmly that she was a good girl. Jilk told his family that this was the well-known Mr. Asao he had spoken to them about. His wife thanked Seitaro graciously for everything he had done for her husband and asked whether the little girl was his granddaughter. Seitaro smiled and said she was, more or less. Far away, in the forest to the north of Foz, something less peaceful was unfolding. A man was chasing a creature through the trees, and after a frantic chase, he caught it and brought it down. He muttered with a grin that getting to run around from something so small was embarrassing. He assured the captured bee that he had no intention of harming it. What he was after was the honey stored in the hive. He tied the creature up while speaking to it in a mocking and casual tone, telling it to lead them to the hive. The bee made some sound in response. The man took this as cooperation and declared everything theirs. He then called out to his companion Danan, telling him to finish off one of the other bees. Hidden behind nearby trees, a group of bees watched in distress. One of them suddenly lunged toward the men in desperation. The man barely glanced at it before slapping it aside effortlessly. He shouted in outrage at the nerve of the creature, then picked up the stunned bee and tossed it to the ground with contempt, muttering insults at it. The hive was being torn apart. Footsteps approached the scene. Someone moved toward the fallen bee on the ground, which was trembling and curling in on itself out of fear. A calm voice called out to the men, asking what they thought they were doing. The men looked up from their destruction. Seitaro told them plainly that he had been informed that destroying a hive to harvest honey was prohibited under Commerce Guild rules. One of the men immediately recognized him as the old man from a previous encounter. Seitaro said with genuine confusion that he did not recall meeting them before and asked more pointedly what they were doing there. The man commented that this was not surprising given Seitaro's age, noting that his hair had looked different the last time. Seitaro said honestly that he did not remember the encounter, but pressed them again to explain themselves. The man reminded him it had been at the wood dungeon. Seitaro then recalled it, his expression clearing. The party leader told him a lot had happened since then, and that he was now in the business of gathering honey. Seitaro asked whether they were sure they were not disturbing the bees in the process. The leader broke into loud laughter at the question, dismissing the very idea of worrying about disturbing what he called worthless bugs. He grabbed one of the bees to make his point, saying that at most these creatures were on the level of a dog or a cat, not even demons. They were just bugs, a little smarter than most, but bugs nonetheless. Seitaro's eyes went cold. The ground beneath the man began to shift, and he started sinking slowly into it, his shock erupting into panicked shouts. He demanded to know what was happening and turned his anger on Seitaro. The leader, now nervous, tried to remind Seitaro that attacking people who were not in the wrong was not something he was permitted to do. Seitaro calmly told the little girl beside him to step back and that it would all be over shortly. He glanced at a flame that had appeared nearby. One of the group's members had launched an attack, shouting for him to stop. Seitaro stepped out of the path of the fire. A moment later the man charged directly at him with a sword, swinging hard. Before the blade could land, Seitaro raised a barrier and blocked it without effort. The man scoffed and asked whether the old man was really going to fight them. The bee on the ground trembled. Seitaro told the group plainly that if this was how they conducted themselves, he would rather speak with the bees. Their behavior, he said, was less honorable than that of the creatures they were dismissing as bugs. The leader erupted in fury, screaming that Seitaro was siding with insects. Seitaro replied that he found these bees to be far more human in their conduct. His wand glowed, and vines erupted from the ground, lifting the men into the air. The leader shouted that he would report Seitaro to the Adventurers Guild for this. The little girl watched the whole thing with wide, excited eyes while the bees watching from behind the trees looked on in focused silence. Seitaro spoke quietly, almost to himself, reflecting that being human was not simply a matter of being born into a human body. It was about how one treated those who were smaller and weaker. Intelligence and strength were secondary considerations at best. The men's faces twisted with disgust and mockery, the leader shouting that the old man had clearly lost his mind. Seitaro shook his head. Then someone appeared suddenly from the side, sliding in to block the path of those trying to escape. The leader ran straight into the obstruction and gasped in pain, looking up to find a pair of cold eyes staring down at him. It was Gould, and his identity carried the full weight of his position, Guildmaster. He told the man, whose name was apparently Locke, that it was time for a long and serious conversation. He included the other two by name as well, Danan and Sheena. All three of them froze where they stood, the confidence draining out of them completely. Gould's voice boomed with fury, making clear that the three men in front of him were not going to be let off lightly this time. Locke went visibly pale. Seitaro stepped in briefly to express mild surprise that the guild master himself had come all the way out, and Gould told him it was no trouble at all for someone like Seitaro, adding that the three men in question were from his own guild branch, which made their behavior his responsibility to deal with directly. He turned back to the three and made it plain that the time for lies was over. He continued scolding them at length. Seitaro glanced behind him and noticed the little girl standing very still, watching Gould with wide and attentive eyes. The two of them stood side by side observing the scene, Seitaro's face calm and unreadable. The scene shifted back briefly to a few days earlier. Seitaro had been looking at the child in her true form, a slime, small and quietly jiggling in place. A status window had appeared before him, revealing what she was. Her name was listed as not yet given. Her species was bright slime. She was 6 months old and had reached level 2. Her skill was listed as absorb, and her special skill was nullify. She carried the protection of Israel, known as All-Father, and bore the title of Maverick. Seitaro had gone quiet looking at all of this. Israel had smiled beside him. The slime looked between them with a confused expression. Seitaro reflected on the special skill, nullify. Even from a basic assessment, he could tell it was extraordinarily powerful. Israel confirmed this, explaining that the skill canceled out all magic and abilities used by enemies, and that through the absorb skill the child could then take in the energy of whatever had been nullified. The little girl in slime form yawned in the middle of the explanation. Israel then brought up the matter of naming her again, asking Seitaro to take on the responsibility. Seitaro pushed back, suggesting that naming someone carrying abilities this significant felt like too large a responsibility to place on him. Israel told him firmly that Seitaro would need to protect her from anyone who might try to exploit her for her powers, and that beyond that, the child herself wanted Seitaro to be the one to choose her name. The little girl's eyes sparkled with unmistakable hope. Seitaro relented, saying he would need to think carefully to choose something worthy of her. Back in the present, Seitaro snapped out of his thoughts. Gould had noticed and asked if he was all right, teasing him about spacing out and wondering aloud whether old age was catching up with him. Seitaro apologized and said he had simply been thinking about something. Gould assured him the three adventurers would be made to answer properly for what they had done, then announced it was time to leave. Seitaro thanked him for making the journey and told him to take care. Gould hauled the three men along with him, and before they parted ways, he turned back with a wide grin and a thumbs up. Seitaro turned his attention to the bees. He told them they would bring the injured ones back to the hive, and he cast a healing spell over the wounded creatures before casting a float spell to carry them gently along. The bees led the way, and Seitaro and the little girl followed. As he walked, Seitaro observed the bees thoughtfully, noting to himself that they showed a level of intelligence unusual for monsters and wondering whether they were close to crossing into the category of demons. The bees signaled that they had arrived. The little girl let out a sound of amazement at what was before them. The queen bee was seated ahead of them, looking mildly surprised at the sight of humans having been brought to her. She expressed her astonishment that humans had helped her children and asked whether the one who had done this understood what had happened. Seitaro acknowledged that he had gathered as much. The queen remarked that it was rare to encounter a human she could communicate with, and then shyly asked for his name, saying he had saved her children and she wished to know who he was. Seitaro told her his name with a smile and downplayed the act, saying he had simply come across the situation while going about his errands. The queen said she had to give him something in thanks, and immediately a collection of jewelry and potions appeared before him. She pointed out one item in particular, a ring that the bees gave only to those they held in genuine trust. Seitaro examined it quietly, sensing that it would protect the wearer from attacks by insect-type monsters and demons. The little girl gazed at the ring with wide and reverent eyes. The queen's attention then shifted to the child. She began to say something and then stopped herself, pausing as though something about the child had given her pause. The little girl looked back at her in silence. The sky above them had begun to slowly darken. The queen asked what the child's name was. The little girl found she could not find any words and simply shrugged, unable to answer. Seitaro told the queen that they had been just on the verge of giving the child her name, and asked whether she would like to be a witness to it. The little girl made a small sound of surprised delight. At that moment, a bright light flashed above them. Everyone looked up. Israel descended slowly from the sky, luminous and unhurried, and the queen stared upward in speechless awe. Seitaro watched with a calm smile. As Israel reached the ground, he announced with pleasure that he had arrived in time for the naming ceremony. Seitaro told him it was not anything as elaborate as a ceremony. Israel disagreed firmly, insisting that this was a deeply important matter. He moved to the little girl and draped a cloak gently around her shoulders, then placed a crown of flowers on her head with careful tenderness. The queen declared that she would serve as witness. Seitaro was quiet for a moment, and then he spoke the name he had chosen, Luce. A warm smile settled across his face as he said it. The little girl's face transformed with joy, and she leapt up, unable to contain herself. Israel said it was a good name. Seitaro said quietly that seeing her that happy had made every bit of the deliberation worthwhile. Israel remarked that asking Seitaro had been the right decision. Luce ran to Seitaro and thanked him with her whole heart, calling him Grandpa. Seitaro smiled and nodded at her with quiet warmth. Then a voice rang out suddenly from nearby, calling urgently for Seitaro. Everyone turned toward the sound. A woman came running toward them, breathless and visibly alarmed. She gathered herself just enough to tell him that something had happened in the city and that he needed to come with her immediately. At the training ground of the Foz Guard, a cat had been watching a butterfly drift through the air and was just about to give chase after the man running nearby, when a sudden burst of commotion shattered the quiet. Voices were calling out in urgent, overlapping waves, asking where the captain was and demanding that someone fetch a doctor immediately. The cat jolted in alarm at the noise. Gould's voice rose above everything else, ordering everyone in the city with any healing ability to be rounded up without delay. A guard nervously reported that everyone available had already been gathered and that they were attempting to use their skills. Further back, one of the men was consumed with worry, his thoughts fixed on Nina. Jilk arrived and took in the chaos, asking what had happened. Nina was sobbing, clutching her injured hand, and the moment she saw her father, she broke into a fresh wave of tears and apologies, repeating that she was sorry over and over. Gould turned on Jilk with barely controlled fury, demanding to know where he had been. Jilk was still trying to understand what had occurred. Gould pressed him. A woman on the scene offered what information she had, explaining that the wound had most likely been caused by a magic tool, which was why conventional healing methods were not working. Nina's mother hovered nearby in growing distress as her daughter cried out in pain. Jilk asked whether they were talking about the magic tool kept in the weapons storage. Gould demanded to know who had given a child access to something like that. Two men standing nearby exchanged glances and murmured between themselves. Then one of them stepped forward with a small, uncomfortable smile and took responsibility, saying it had been him and that his daughter had asked. The other man behind him called out in surprise, but the first continued, saying he had told the child it would be fine just to touch it, and that the other man shared some of the responsibility for not stopping him. Jilk turned on them and asked whether they had really let a child touch a magic tool. The second man stumbled over his words and grew increasingly nervous. Jilk turned away from them, saying that in that moment he did not care who was at fault. What mattered was Nina. Gould erupted again, his distress taking over as he raged about the gravity of the situation, a young girl's finger on her right hand. He called on whatever mercy the gods might offer. Nina kept crying through her pain. One of the guards delivered troubling news. Standard healing spells had not worked, and the only magic that might help was resurrection. Jilk immediately pushed back on this, pointing out how few mages in the world possessed the ability to use resurrection, and that outside of the imperial capital, finding one was nearly impossible. Then rapid footsteps rang out, and a woman burst into the room, breathless from running. She gasped out that she had found someone. Gould recognized her as the elf from before and asked immediately about Nina's condition. Jilk told him quietly that amputation of the finger was likely the only remaining option, and then turned to ask who the woman had found. She caught her breath and announced with confidence that she had located someone capable of healing Nina, and that he was nearly there. The guards exchanged looks, wondering whether she had somehow found an imperial-class mage. Jilk asked directly who was coming. The woman began to explain, then paused, assuming the answer would be obvious to everyone given where they were. A loud bang interrupted her. Seitaro walked in, muttering quietly to himself that the place was always so lively. The guards stared at him with visible deflation. One of them addressed him carefully, not wanting to be rude, but asking whether the old man happened to be some kind of high-level mage. Seitaro smiled and asked if he looked like one, introducing himself simply as a regular merchant. In the background, one of the men who had caused the situation clenched his jaw. Gould cut through the formalities and told Seitaro loudly that none of that mattered right now and to do something quickly. Seitaro took in the situation calmly, moving toward Nina and speaking gently to her, telling her not to worry and that he would have her fixed up in time. Jilk stared at him in disbelief, asking whether he was really capable of this. Without any further delay, Seitaro cast the resurrection spell. Nina's wound began to glow. Her crying stopped. She looked down at her hand with wide eyes and told her mother that her finger no longer hurt. Her mother reacted with breathless shock, struggling to believe what she was seeing. Nina said the pain was completely gone. Jilk's voice broke with relief as he called Nina's name. Gould burst into tears of joy and gratitude, overcome by the outcome. The guards stood around in stunned silence, unable to process the fact that a merchant had just demonstrated a level of magical ability that should have been impossible for someone of his description. Gould grabbed Seitaro in a tight embrace, declaring through his emotion exactly what he had always suspected, that Seitaro was extraordinary. Seitaro told him with fond exasperation that he was always so dramatic. The man who had been at fault came rushing toward Nina with relief flooding his face. Nina looked up at him and told him with a small, tired smile that everything was all right now. The man exhaled, the weight of his guilt giving way to overwhelming relief. The other man turned toward Seitaro, who was quietly trying to settle the excited crowd around him. Seitaro remarked that when he had heard there was an injury at the training grounds, he had not expected the person hurt to be such a young child. The guards nearby were already talking among themselves about him, one expressing amazement, and another noting that he clearly had some kind of connection with Gould, who had just given Seitaro a hearty slap on the back. Nina, recovered and bright-eyed, called out happily to her parents. Jilk gathered his family into a hug, overcome with relief, and Nina's mother wept with the release of all the fear she had been holding. She reminded Jilk that he needed to go and express their gratitude to Seitaro properly. Jilk agreed and looked around the crowd for the old man, wondering where he had gone. The guards had surrounded Seitaro completely. One of them recognized him as the person who had been with the captain during the monster incident in the dungeon. Another insisted he had to be a healing specialist and begged him to take them on as a student. Someone else wanted to know what workshop his wand had come from. Seitaro tried to clear up the misconceptions, explaining that he did not know exactly how much magical aptitude he actually had, that his area was support magic, and that he was genuinely just a merchant. Two of the guards exchanged a look, one of them poking the other, and noting that Seitaro's support magic looked nothing like what they had seen from others. Seitaro watched them with quiet amusement. Jilk pushed through the crowd and asked people to make way. He told Seitaro that his daughter wanted to thank him. Seitaro said it was not necessary. Jilk suggested that in return, perhaps Nina could spend some time playing with Luce. Nina brightened at this, and Luce immediately broke into joyful excitement at seeing Nina again, rushing to hug her and praising Nina for how brave she had been through something that must have hurt terribly. Nina hugged her back and thanked her. The guards watched the warmth of the scene with soft expressions. Nina then turned and thanked Seitaro directly, her voice sincere and sweet. Seitaro accepted her thanks with a gentle smile. Nina murmured to herself that magic was a truly remarkable thing. One of the guards asked whether the small girl's name was Luce. Another told both children that they were the city guard and that if anything ever came up, all they had to do was call. Jilk asked Seitaro what his plans were for the rest of the day. Seitaro told him he had been on his way to the workshop to visit a business partner before the emergency had called him away. He made his way to the workshop afterward. Polonia greeted him with bright enthusiasm the moment he arrived, asking about the platter Adi had brought her and whether it was true that Seitaro knew how to produce the same kind of finish. He confirmed it was the urushi lacquer process. She asked whether it was really made from tree sap, and he confirmed that as well, specifically the sap that had been discarded as useless in the wood dungeon all this time. He mentioned it might also make a beautiful finish on the tea canisters and added that using heating magic would speed the process up considerably. Polonia said she understood, acknowledged that her own aptitude for magic was limited, and said she would look for someone skilled in that area to assist. She then added, with something close to shyness, that it was Seitaro himself who had told her there was no shame in asking others for help or guidance. Seitaro acknowledged this with a quiet laugh and a smile, saying that yes, he supposed he might have said something of that sort. Polonia then asked what had actually brought him to the workshop that day. Seitaro said he had been wondering where she purchased her tools, and that he was looking to get his hands on a hand blade to try something out. He added that he would of course pay her a referral fee for the recommendation. Polonia laughed and waved off the offer, saying everything he had done for her already made payment unnecessary. Seitaro pushed back, saying that the world did not operate on free favors, and that if Adi found out she had given him something for nothing, there was no telling how she might react. The image of an irritated Adi flashed clearly through Polonia's mind, and she quickly decided that taking payment in the form of urushi lacquer would suit her just fine. Seitaro smiled. Lou stood nearby watching the exchange with a puzzled expression, not quite following the adult logic of it. At that moment, Adi knocked at the door and came in carrying food for Polonia, greeting her cheerfully. Polonia muttered under her breath about the timing. Adi immediately asked what she meant. Before anyone could respond, a sharp cracking sound rang out. A stone had rolled across the floor and struck one of the wooden toys. Adi jolted in alarm at the sight of it. Polonia's expression hardened immediately. She recognized this as the work of the same people who had caused trouble before. She bolted outside to confront them, only to find they had already fled. She stood in the street with her fist clenched tight in frustration. Seitaro's expression became serious as he took in what had just happened. The night grew darker around them. The following morning at the training ground, something unexpected was entertaining the guards. Luce's voice rang out with fierce energy as she took on the guards one after another, sending them to the ground and demanding the next challenger. Jilk watched from a distance with quiet astonishment, remarking that he had never seen attacks like hers and that some of the guards were genuinely taking a beating. Gould observed beside him and said it made a certain kind of sense, given that she was Seitaro's granddaughter in all but name. Nearby, one of the young men being mentored by Seitaro accidentally released a burst of black liquid onto the ground close to one of the guards, alarming him considerably. The young man scratched his head and apologized, explaining that Seitaro had been teaching them support magic and they were experimenting with different applications. He promised they would be more useful next time. The guard accepted this with a slightly stunned expression. A short distance away, the three of them, Seitaro, Gould, and Jilk, were gathered around what appeared to be a game of stones, talking while they played. Seitaro placed a white stone and reflected aloud that getting real results required slow and gradual planning. Jilk brought up the matter of beefing up security around the workshop, acknowledging that having guards stationed nearby was fine, but that Seitaro's own presence in the area from time to time would likely do more good than a permanent rotation. Gould agreed, noting that Seitaro had become something of a well-known figure in the city. Gould's hand trembled slightly as he placed his black stone. Seitaro set a white stone beside it in response. Gould scratched his head and pointed out that if Seitaro was asking Jilk to keep an eye on things, it probably meant the old man had already decided where he was going next. He asked where that was. Seitaro smiled and told him that before he headed out, there was one more thing he needed Gould's help with. Seitaro moved a potato back and forth against the slicer in a steady, practiced motion while Nina and Lou stood close by and watched with wide and curious eyes. He walked them through the process, slicing the potato into thin pieces and then lowering them carefully into the hot oil. And when it was done, he held up the finished result for them to see. Potato chips. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with quiet satisfaction. Nina exclaimed at how crispy they were, and Luce leaned in and breathed in the smell with delight. A voice came from nearby. Someone had been watching and remarked with interest that Seitaro had come up with yet another new dish, noting that frying meant cooking something in a pot of hot oil. The person then mentioned that they had brought the potatoes he had asked for, and had even added a few extra. Seitaro smiled warmly and thanked them, genuinely pleased by the gesture. The smell of the frying had already begun drifting through the air, and before long the sound of hurried, excited footsteps could be heard approaching from outside. Everyone paused and listened as the footsteps drew closer. Two children came bursting in, immediately struck by how wonderful everything smelled and demanding to know what it was. One of the little girls recognized straight away that it had to be Seitaro's doing and wondered aloud whether they should offer to help him again. Seitaro greeted them warmly and told them they were full of energy as always, but before anything else, he asked them to go and wash their hands at the well. The girl looked confused and asked why that was necessary. Seitaro began to answer, but Luce jumped in ahead of him, explaining that unwashed hands could cause a stomach ache or even bring on a fever. Seitaro thought to himself with quiet pride that Luce had gotten it exactly right. The children reacted with amazement, wondering how she knew something like that, and then ran off with excitement to do as they were told. Calf called after them to calm down, reminding them that there was plenty for everyone. When the children came back and settled, one of the little girls looked at the chips in her hand and murmured to herself that this was what a potato looked like in this form. Both children grabbed a chip and bit into it. Their eyes lit up instantly. They could not believe how good it tasted. One of the girls was stunned that something made from potatoes could taste like this, and pointed out that even though it was fried, it was nothing at all like the donut she had eaten before. Luce told them proudly that it was completely different. It was called potato chips, and her grandfather had invented it. The girl looked over at Seitaro with admiration in her eyes. Meanwhile, Adi set something down nearby and let Seitaro know she was leaving it there for him. He acknowledged her without pausing his cooking, and the children called out to him again, saying how incredible it tasted. He waved at them happily. Outside the inn, the atmosphere was lively and cheerful. Nina, Luce, and the two children had settled on the grass together. Luce held up a potato chip and told the others that this was what a potato could become. Nina marveled at how incredibly thin it had been cut. Luce explained that she had used a special tool she had made herself from a hand blade to get the slices so fine. Nina asked what came next after cutting, and Luce described the process. A quick fry in very hot oil, and just like that, the potato became something entirely new. One of the little girls said softly that Seitaro seemed to know so much about everything. Luce explained that it was because he was a peddler. He had come from a faraway place and had traveled from city to city across his whole life, and that was how he had gathered all of that knowledge. Nina was surprised to hear that Luce had been traveling alongside him too. The other girl wondered whether that kind of life ever got lonely. Luce smiled and said that they still had places to go and people to tell about the donuts and potato chips they had discovered together, and that if Seitaro had never set out on his travels in the first place, none of them would have met each other at all. The children agreed that this was true. Just then, Adi's voice rang out from inside, calling the children in and telling them it was time to eat. They jumped up and ran toward her with enthusiasm. She reminded them to wash their hands and rinse their mouths before sitting down to eat, and they followed her instruction without complaint. One of the girls pointed excitedly when she saw the food laid out, and the children shouted their readiness. While they were washing up, someone asked Luz whether she was going to be leaving again with Seitaro. Luz said yes without any hesitation, saying she would always stay with her grandfather. Someone else asked which city they were heading to next, and the questions and chatter continued as everyone settled in and began happily eating the potato chips together. Seitaro watched them all and told them to chew properly before swallowing and to make sure they tried a little bit of everything rather than just eating one thing. He looked around at the children's happy faces and thought to himself that he could not remember ever seeing them this excited before. He smiled widely. After a moment, he suggested that since things had settled into a comfortable rhythm, it might be a good time to eat together and also talk a little business. Adi produced a map that had all the city roads marked on it, just as Seitaro had requested. She noted that under normal circumstances a map this large would be difficult to carry around, but Seitaro pointed out that with his inventory ability, that was not a problem at all. He spread the map out and studied it, realizing that he had not yet decided where he wanted to go next. He worked out their current position, which he believed to be Foz, and traced the paths ahead. Adi walked him through the options. Following the road north would bring them to Lake Alkin, while heading southeast would take them to Lyca's beach. Luz had been listening closely and leaned in with bright eyes when she heard the words coast and lake mentioned. Seitaro confirmed that both were real places he had never actually seen for himself. He explained the two to her simply. A beach was where the land met an enormous body of salt water, and a lake was a large body of fresh water, sitting in one place. Luz's excitement was immediate. She wanted to see both of these water places with her own eyes. Seitaro smiled at her enthusiasm and said that he understood completely, and that in that case they would simply have to choose one of the two to head toward. Adi said she thought that was a fine idea and brought the conversation back to the map spread out before them. She pointed out the two routes available. If they followed the path heading north, they would reach Lake Alkin. If they went southeast instead, the road would take them to the ocean at Lyca's beach. She noted that both areas were well known among traders for being good places to find rare goods that were hard to come across elsewhere. However, she added an important practical point. Reaching Lyca's would take a full month of travel, even by wagon. With that in mind, she suggested that Seitaro head to Lake Alkin first, as it was the more reachable of the two destinations. Seitaro nodded and agreed that made sense. He thought it through quietly and settled on a simple plan. They would travel to Lake Alkin on foot first, and from there, make their way to Lyca's afterward. Adi then offered to do something that would make the trip easier for him. She said she could write a letter of introduction addressed to the head of the Commerce Guild in Alkin, which would smooth things over when he arrived and help him get started without unnecessary trouble. Seitaro thanked her warmly for the offer, genuinely touched by her thoughtfulness. His mind then turned to the practical question of what he would actually sell once they got there. He thought out loud, wondering whether tea or coffee might be a good starting point for his goods. Adi agreed right away, saying his tea leaves were of particularly fine quality and would likely do well. Kaf added a useful piece of information, that becoming a recognized peddler in the area required nothing more than registering at the guild, which was a straightforward enough thing to do. Seitaro smiled and said that being settled there, he might just put Luz to work as the face of his stall. He glanced toward the window and noticed quietly that the sun was going down. One of the girls had already begun tidying up the bowls without being asked. Seitaro noted that the little ones had all fallen asleep. The girl replied that it was no wonder, since they had played so hard and completely tired themselves out. Kaf remarked with a grin that Seitaro's granddaughter had become something of a well-known and beloved figure around there. Seitaro said he was genuinely glad that everyone had taken such a liking to her. Then the door opened and Jilk's wife came in, looking for Nina. She called out to her and noticed with mild amusement that the girl was still napping at that hour, saying it would probably make it difficult for her to sleep later in the night. Nina stirred and looked up in a daze at the sound of her mother's voice. She gathered herself and said her farewells to everyone around her with cheerful warmth, and the other children called after her as she headed out. The house settled into quiet once she was gone. In the calm that followed, Seitaro said that now that things had wound down, he would like to hear more about Lake Alkin. Adi was happy to share. She described it as a truly wonderful place in every respect. The city, the people who lived there, and the surrounding nature were all worth seeing. Because the lake served as a useful waterway for trade, the area was always full of life, with all kinds of people and goods moving through it on a regular basis. She also mentioned that certain plants and creatures could only be found in that particular area and nowhere else in the world, and that children especially tended to love everything about it. Kaf added with enthusiasm that Lake Alkin was also known for a wide variety of fish that could only be caught there and nowhere else. Adi turned to him with a puzzled look at the mention of catching fish. But Seitaro's eyes had already lit up at the word. His thoughts began racing, his mind filling with vivid images and old memories all at once. Adi tried to get his attention back, but he was already somewhere else in his head. Kaf nodded knowingly beside her. After a moment, Seitaro came back to the conversation and mentioned something he had just remembered. The elf girl they had met before had told him she would also be passing through the lake area on her way home. Adi recalled her immediately, asking whether she meant the girl from the time Nina had been hurt, the one named Chloe. She pointed out that this was yet another good reason for Seitaro to make Lake Alkin his next destination. Seitaro agreed readily. Adi then asked whether he had already begun getting ready for the trip. He told her they were almost finished with preparations and that all he had left to do was say a prayer and take care of one last thing. Both Adi and Calf reacted with surprise at those words, and the conversation continued on from there as the night grew late around them. Morning came. Luce woke up, stretched with a yawn, and immediately ran over to Seitaro with bright and eager energy, wishing him good morning and asking whether they were going somewhere that day. Seitaro told her yes, but said that before anything else, she needed to sit down and eat her breakfast properly. She did, and afterward the two of them set off together. Their first stop was the chapel. A priest there greeted Seitaro with genuine gratitude, thanking him for his donation of chairs for the congregation and expressing how much it was appreciated. Seitaro deflected the thanks warmly, saying that the credit really belonged to the skilled woodworker who had made them, and encouraged the priest to seek her out and hear what she had to offer. They exchanged farewells, and Seitaro and Luce moved on. Just as they were leaving, a familiar figure appeared. It was Israel. Seitaro greeted him with pleasant surprise, saying he had not expected to run into the real thing in a place like this. Israel looked at the chairs being brought in and remarked with satisfaction that chairs for the congregation was a wonderful gift and that everyone who attended would be very pleased, adding that if the chairs had been made by Polonia, they were sure to be extremely comfortable. Seitaro told Israel that he had also come to pray for safe travels and success in his business ventures ahead. Israel responded in a light tone, acknowledging that he might not appear to be the most dependable figure at first glance, but that as a god he was in fact quite generous. He then observed that it did not look as though Seitaro had come solely to pray for himself. Seitaro admitted this was true. What he had in mind was less a formal prayer and more of a request, or perhaps simply something he wanted to discuss. Luce stood nearby and listened carefully to every word. Israel asked with interest whether it was a discussion rather than a prayer, and whether the matter concerned the city. He said he would be happy to discuss anything at all. Seitaro gently told him it was not wise to make that kind of open offer before knowing what the conversation was actually about. Israel replied that when it came to Seitaro specifically, he had no concerns whatsoever. Seitaro thanked him for the trust, but pressed on to the point. He wanted to talk about the white cat. He said he had a feeling the cat belonged to Israel. Israel confirmed it without hesitation. The cat was one of his emissaries, he explained, and through her he had been keeping a quiet watch over Seitaro all along. Seitaro asked how exactly that worked. The passers-by who happened to walk past smiled at the sight of Luce nearby, happily playing with the cat without a care in the world. After a little while, Seitaro called out to Luce and let her know they were finished. She looked up and asked if he was done, and then the two of them left the shrine and continued on their way. As they walked, Seitaro said he was relieved that Israel had agreed to his request. Israel replied that of course he had. He was genuinely impressed that even in times like these Seitaro remained so thoughtful and considerate of others. He added that the cat herself would be glad to be of help. Seitaro smiled and said that would be very welcome. Israel mentioned that the cat was also very fond of Seitaro, which made the arrangement all the more fitting. Luce, walking alongside them, was smiling to herself as she played contentedly with the cat's tail. Israel continued, saying that the cat was remarkably intelligent, and that if Seitaro wanted her to take on the kind of task he had described, he was confident she would carry it out brilliantly. Seitaro thanked him with genuine warmth. Israel asked in a calm and knowing way whether that was truly everything Seitaro had wanted to discuss. Seitaro let out a quiet, slightly sheepish sound and admitted that Israel had seen right through him. There was in fact one more thing he wanted to bring up. Israel smiled and reminded him simply that appearances aside, he was a god in this world. The cat, meanwhile, had drifted off to sleep on top of Luce's head. Israel suggested they move on to the next part of their conversation. By the time they reached the forest, the afternoon had settled into a beautiful and peaceful calm. Seitaro looked around and murmured that he thought this was roughly the right spot. The two of them stood quietly for a moment, looking up at the trees and the sky above. Seitaro remarked that it was hard to picture the chaos they had experienced there before when the monster had come. The forest was so still now that the memory felt distant and almost unreal. Then the bushes nearby rustled. A man came into view, and he was furious. He slammed his fist down hard and unleashed his frustration in a loud and angry voice. He had been working so much harder and for so much longer. He raged, so why was it that the other one kept getting called first? His voice carried through the trees. Seitaro and Israel stared at him with wide eyes. Seitaro murmured quietly to himself that this was quite a sight. The man kept going, shouting that he provided support magic and that at best he played a supporting role. So what gave the other one the right to act so superior just because things had gone well a couple of times? He kept throwing punches into the air as he ranted, his frustration pouring out of him with no sign of stopping. The young man shouted that he was not a sidekick, his voice full of wounded pride. At that exact moment, vines shot out and wrapped firmly around his hand. He gasped and cried out in pain and confusion. Seitaro spoke to him calmly, pointing out that sidekicks could turn out to be remarkably powerful, and used a moment to share something more important. With magic, he said, it was never simply about natural ability. What truly mattered was knowing when to use it, where to use it, and how to use it. A short silence followed. The young man let out a grudging sound and admitted that the other person had always been better at magic than him. But he had skipped practice constantly because he simply had not wanted to bother with support magic. He sulked at his own admission. The other young man cut in sharply, saying that someone who used attack magic would never be able to understand what it felt like from his side. Seitaro murmured quietly to himself that it seemed these two had known each other for a very long time. The first young man snapped back that it did not matter either way. Seitaro gently disagreed, saying that it seemed to matter quite a lot. From where he was standing, he said the frustration the young man felt toward his friend and the frustration he felt about his magic appeared to come from the very same place. Seitaro continued, reminding them both that the most important thing about magic was not natural aptitude, and it was not even about the person wielding it. The blond boy turned toward him, caught off guard by the words. The other young man's eyes fixed on Seitaro as well, listening closely now. Seitaro asked them simply whether they understood what he meant. Just then, another person stepped into the scene with easy confidence. It was Gould who called out in a cheerful voice and asked with a grin whether he had walked in on one of the old man's famous lessons. Seitaro turned to him with recognition and greeted him warmly, then asked whether Gould happened to know the answer to the question. Gould replied immediately and without any hesitation. It was all about how magic was used. Seitaro acknowledged that it was a very fitting answer coming from him. The two young men turned away from each other, neither quite ready to fully face what had been said. Gould muttered to himself, wondering if he had gotten it wrong. The afternoon light gradually faded as evening began to settle in around them. As the small group walked together through the growing dark, Seitaro asked Gould what had brought the guild master out into the forest looking for these two young men in the first place. Gould explained that Jilk had asked him to find them. He then looked at Israel with curious eyes, asking who exactly this person was and wondering out loud whether he might be a student of Seitaro's. Israel hesitated for just a moment before answering carefully, saying that yes, something like that was probably the right way to describe it, and that Seitaro had taught him a great deal. Gould said quietly that Seitaro really was a good person, through and through. Seitaro replied that Gould was as confident as ever. Gould protested that he had been giving a compliment. Seitaro said warmly that so had he. The next morning, Seitaro and Luce arrived at the workshop together. Luce called out a cheerful good morning as they came through the door. What followed was not a quiet greeting. A loud voice rang out immediately, belonging to Ponia, who announced with great feeling that she simply could not believe what Seitaro had done. She had heard from the people at the shrine that he had put her name forward to replace their old chairs. She explained that this was the very first time the shrine had ever given her work, and that the people there were so serious and particular about everything that she had been incredibly nervous, but she felt she had done a good job. Seitaro told her that the shrine was the place the whole city turned to during disasters, just as it had been when the monsters had gone out of control not long ago. Ponia nodded with full understanding and said that was exactly why she was going to put everything she had into making those chairs as strong and sturdy as possible. She smiled and thanked Seitaro with deep and genuine warmth. He smiled back and told her simply to make them well. Ponia then mentioned something else. She had also finished making the tea canisters, using the technique Seitaro had taught her. He responded with obvious pleasure, saying of course she had, and noting that they would be extremely useful when he went to sell his tea leaves and coffee beans. Ponia said she had made a few extras as well, and told him to take whatever he needed. Seitaro thanked her and said that it was probably time for him to take everything and move on to the next town. At that moment, a voice burst through from outside. Someone had found him. Gould came in with the energy of someone who had been searching for a while, announcing that everyone had wanted to see Seitaro off and had been looking all over for him. Seitaro smiled with a mixture of pleasure and mild embarrassment, saying it was a little overwhelming, but that he was truly happy they had all come. Gould told him with affectionate bluntness that he was not getting any younger and that he needed to take care of himself out there. Adi added that he had to make sure to come back and visit. Then Nina came running in, calling out for Luce with the kind of urgency that only children have when they're trying not to be too late. Luce lit up at the sight of her and called back just as warmly. Nina's eyes filled with tears almost immediately. Jilk stood nearby and said quietly that Seitaro had saved his daughter, and that if he ever needed anything at all, he only had to say the word. Seitaro thanked him sincerely and said that if such a time came, he would not hesitate to reach out. Nina sobbed and made Luce promise to come back, so they could play their chip game and their adventure game and all the other games they loved together. Luce called out to Nina with a bright and steady voice, telling her that they would see each other again and that she should not cry. She promised that it would not be long, and that Nina just had to wait a little while. Jilk said on behalf of everyone that they would all be waiting for the two of them to return. Gould, for all his confidence, was not managing to hold himself together very well either. He swallowed hard, his eyes wet, and told the old man to stay out of trouble and remember that he was not as young as he used to be. Seitaro smiled and told them all that he knew and thanked every single one of them from the bottom of his heart for everything. Luce added her own warm farewell and told them all she would see them again soon. As Seitaro and Luce turned to leave, the voices behind them called out one last time. Gould shouted that he was going to get really good by the time they came back, so they had better be ready to place a big order. Adi called after them that if they ever needed anything, no matter where they were or when, they only had to ask. It was a promise. Seitaro waved one last time without turning all the way around and murmured to himself that they really were a wonderful group of people. He and Luce glanced back one final time with warm smiles before facing forward and continuing on their way. After they had been walking for a good while, Seitaro remarked that they had already covered quite a distance. He asked Luce gently whether she was getting tired. She told him she was fine and that she could keep walking. He looked at her and noticed something quiet and a little heavy in her expression. He told her softly that if she was feeling lonely, she was welcome to stay behind and wait for him at the shrine in the city. Luce shook her head quickly and firmly. She said she was fine, and then said something that made Seitaro go still. She told him that he was probably lonely too. Wasn't he going somewhere so far away? And because of that, she was going to go with him, so that he would not have to be lonely. Seitaro's eyes went wide. He stood there for a moment and thought quietly to himself what a brave and remarkable child she was. Then he told her gently that she had a very kind heart, and promised her that at the next and along the way, he would show her something very nice. As the two of them sat quietly beside the lake, Seitaro told Luce to stay still for a moment. If she kept moving around like that, she would frighten the fish and they would swim away. Luce asked curiously what the nice surprise was that he had mentioned earlier. He told her it was still a surprise and that he would show her when they reached the inn in the next town. Luce's excitement bubbled over immediately, and she asked whether they could leave soon, wanting to get there as quickly as possible. Not far away, hidden among the bushes at the edge of the trees, something was watching them in silence. Seitaro suddenly felt a tug on his fishing line and let out a surprised sound. Luce burst out with delight at the sight of a fish on the end of it. In the bushes, a creature lifted its nose and sniffed the air. Seitaro turned his head and caught a glimpse of something small and still among the leaves. It looked like a puppy, though he noted it was unusual to see one out here in a place like this. The small creature watched them without making a sound. Seitaro said quietly that he hoped it was not lost. Luce spotted it too and immediately lit up, whispering excitedly to Seitaro that there was a dog and that it was looking right at them. The creature flinched at her voice. Seitaro gently told Luce to try not to startle it. Luce immediately slowed herself down and began creeping toward it carefully, whispering that she understood. Seitaro sat back for a moment and noticed how much time had passed without him realizing it. They had been there for quite a while now. He began to think it might be time to have some lunch. Meanwhile, Luce moved slowly and steadily toward the small creature. It shifted nervously at her approach and glanced down at itself. Luce kept her expression soft and open, speaking to it in a gentle and reassuring way, letting it know that she meant no harm and that it had nothing to be afraid of. The creature suddenly snapped back at her in a sharp voice, telling her to be quiet and that things were very much not okay. Luce stopped in her tracks, completely caught off guard. Her mouth fell open. The creature had spoken. An actual, understandable voice had come out of it. Seitaro turned toward them and came over to have a closer look. He took one look at the creature and recognized what it actually was, not a puppy at all but a kobold. The kobold demanded to know who the two of them were. Luce introduced herself immediately with her usual energy. Then she looked more carefully at the kobold and told Seitaro with concern that it was injured. Seitaro agreed that this was not good and raised his wand without hesitation, casting a healing spell. The kobold blinked as the injury faded and offered a quiet word of thanks. Seitaro responded warmly. Then the kobold suddenly went rigid with alarm. It cried out that its people were in danger. Something terrible was happening and they needed help right now. Seitaro and Luce looked at each other for just a moment, and without any further discussion, they followed the kobold as it ran. The kobold glanced back and asked whether the old man was not frightened of it. Luce called back as she ran that there was no reason for her grandfather to be scared. The kobold said that humans were generally so violent toward its kind, and yet they hated and feared demons in the same breath. Luce went quiet for a short moment, and then said simply that she herself was a demon, but that the people she had met had mostly been kind to her. The kobold turned to look at her with surprise, and then they all kept running. Deeper in the forest, a terrible situation was already unfolding. A group of kobolds was being pushed back by closing goblins. One kobold had fallen and could not get up. The others begged it to rise and come with them. The fallen one shouted back at them to leave it behind and save themselves. The goblins drew closer. Hidden in the undergrowth nearby, an elven girl named Chloe had been watching. She pressed forward carefully and whispered a spell, grapple. Plants erupted from the ground and wrapped themselves tightly around the goblins' feet, pulling them off balance and sending them crashing down with shouts of surprise and anger. Chloe held her breath and checked whether it had worked. Her face broke into a look of fierce excitement when she saw that it had. She thought quickly that the noise must have startled the kobolds, and she felt a pang of regret for the commotion. Then something else came crashing through the trees toward her. A horned rabbit was bearing down on her position. Chloe gasped and scrambled. The goblins on the ground were already beginning to struggle back to their feet, shrieking and writhing against the vines. Then a much larger and more terrifying presence made itself known. A massive monster stepped out from the trees and brought its full force down against a tree trunk, shattering it. Chloe stared in horror. It was a homogoblin, a creature far beyond anything the goblin she had been dealing with could compare to. She could not understand what something like that was doing in this part of the forest. The homogoblin grinned with ugly satisfaction. Tears began to fall from Chloe's eyes as her mind raced desperately for any answer to the question of what she could possibly do. Then, out of nowhere, a small figure jumped forward and planted herself directly between Chloe and the monster. Chloe stared, unable to believe what she was seeing. It was Luce, standing perfectly still in front of the Homogoblin with her chin up, declaring in a clear and steady voice that it was obvious trouble had found this place. She announced that the goblins were disturbing the peace of the forest, and that she, Luce, was going to put a stop to their violence. Chloe's jaw dropped completely. Every part of her was screaming inside that Luce needed to run immediately, that this was far too dangerous for her to be anywhere near. The goblins fixed their eyes on the two small figures in front of them. The Homogoblin let out a slow, drooling grin as it looked down at Luce. Chloe pushed herself in front of Luce and told her sharply to get away from there and leave this to her. The goblins let out a roar and came charging straight toward them. Just as the goblins came charging forward, a familiar voice cut through the chaos with calm and easy confidence. Chloe spun around in disbelief at the sound of it. Seitaro stepped into view with a small smile, taking in the situation at a glance, and remarking that it looked like someone was in trouble. The kobold who had led them there cried out with overwhelming relief that everyone was all right. Without wasting a single moment, Seitaro raised his wand and cast two spells in quick succession, Float and Bind. The monsters were lifted off the ground instantly, and thick vines coiled around them before they had any chance to react. Chloe shouted his name with pure relief. The Homogoblin, now suspended in the air and tangled in vines, struggled furiously against the hold, its eyes wide with something it had probably never felt before: fear. Seitaro told it plainly that sheer force alone was not going to be enough to break free from that. He took a step back and stood quietly for a moment, thinking to himself that he would rather not have to kill them if there was any way around it. Then something tugged gently at his sleeve. He looked down at Luce, and then looked back up at the goblins hanging in the air above them. To his surprise, the goblins looked less like creatures mid-attack and more like creatures mid-apology. They seemed to be expressing regret, not defiance. Seitaro let out a quiet sound of exasperation, muttering that he could not believe they were actually apologizing on behalf of their leader. One of the smaller goblins was crying. Seitaro canceled his spells and let them all come back down. He warned them firmly that if they ever caused harm again, things would not end so gently for them next time. The kobold who had brought Seitaro and Luce there was stunned. It could not understand why he was simply letting them go. Seitaro turned to the goblins and told them directly that they had entered another creature's territory and taken things that did not belong to them, and that there was no reason they needed to do that in order to survive in this vast forest. The goblins lowered their heads in a bow. They left without further trouble. Seitaro then turned his attention to Chloe and asked what she had been doing out here in the first place. Chloe admitted with some embarrassment that she had gotten herself lost again. Later, a fire crackled as everyone gathered around the warmth of a bonfire together. Chloe confirmed that she understood everything that had been discussed. Seitaro noted that the kobolds had not had any problems with goblins before all of this. The kobold leader explained that the forest was deep and vast enough that the two groups had rarely even crossed paths, and that they had always kept their distance from each other naturally. That peaceful arrangement had only broken down when the hobgoblin had arrived and changed the balance of things. Seitaro said he hoped the hobgoblin had taken something useful away from what had just happened. Behind the group, Luce and one of the younger kobolds had found each other and were happily playing together. Something nearby caught Seitaro's eye, a stone, glinting softly in the firelight. He stared at it and felt a wave of nostalgia wash over him quietly. The kobold leader stepped forward and bowed deeply, thanking Seitaro for saving their tribe. As a gesture of their gratitude, he wanted to give something to him. Seitaro looked at what was being offered, and his eyes widened with delight. It was a dish that looked genuinely delicious. The kobolds smiled warmly at his reaction. Then, from somewhere nearby, a stomach let out a long and honest growl. Seitaro glanced over and noticed one of the kobolds hunched over a small stove, blowing carefully on the fire beneath it. The sight gave him an idea. He moved closer and told the kobold to watch what he was about to do and then follow along. What followed was a full preparation of food, with Seitaro working steadily until everything was ready. He announced that it was done and invited everyone to eat together. They gathered around and dug in. Luce declared with complete certainty that her grandfather's cooking was the best. The kobolds were in full agreement, eagerly asking for more. Everyone ate with joy, and Seitaro watched them all with a satisfied smile. When the meal was finished, the kobold leader spoke again with a grateful and slightly troubled expression. He pointed out that the food Seitaro had just cooked had actually been intended as the tribe's thank you gift to him, and that instead Seitaro had turned it around and used it to feed everyone, including the kobolds themselves. He asked sincerely how they could possibly make it up to him. Seitaro thought for a moment and made a simple request. He asked whether they might share some of their ohajiki pieces with Luce. The leader blinked, clearly expecting something far more significant, and said that if that was truly all he wanted, they could arrange it right away. Chloe came over to Seitaro and showed him one of the shards, saying how beautiful it was and mentioning that she was actually quite skilled at finding and digging up pieces like these. Seitaro laughed lightly and admitted he had been thinking about collecting some himself. He then shifted the conversation back to Chloe, reminding her that she had mentioned she was supposed to be heading home to her forest. Chloe flinched with visible embarrassment. She admitted that partway through her journey, she had realized she had been walking in entirely the wrong direction, so she had decided she might as well stop at Alkin before turning back around to go home. Seitaro took this in and asked whether she would like to travel with them. Before she could answer, the kobold leader came hurrying back with a collection of pieces he had managed to gather together, asking hopefully whether it would be enough for the Ohajiki game. Chloe's eyes went wide the moment she saw them, exclaiming at how shiny and beautiful they were. Seitaro leaned in and looked closely at the pieces, murmuring to himself with growing interest. The kobold leaned in proudly as well, boasting that he had found and dug them up himself. Luce, who had been playing nearby with the younger kobold, jumped in and agreed that she was pretty good at finding pieces like those too. The young kobold shouted back that he could still eat more. Luce immediately echoed the request for more food. Seitaro looked between the two of them with a quiet smile, thinking to himself that those two were getting along just fine. He then turned back to the kobold leader with something more serious on his mind. He told him that if the tribe had more of these Ohajiki shards, there might actually be a way to use them to solve the territory problem that had been causing all their trouble. He suggested the idea of trading the shards in exchange for food. The kobold leader's face lit up with immediate and genuine excitement at the word food, and he began rattling off ideas about how many fish a single shard might be worth. Seitaro smiled and told him gently that they were not talking about 1 or 2 fish. Seitaro explained that a single one of those shards could be traded for somewhere between 30 and 40 fish. The kobold leader reacted with pure shock, unable to believe such a number was possible. He pointed out that the tribe could never eat that much fish on their own. Seitaro agreed and said that was exactly why the idea would be to break the trading up into smaller amounts, or to store the shards somewhere safe and trade them little by little over time as food was needed. The leader asked with wide eyes whether something like that was truly possible. Seitaro thought to himself that it might not be something that could be set up right away, but he told the leader to give him a little time to work on it. In the meantime, he offered to share some of his own rations so that everyone would have enough to eat while things were being arranged. The kobold leader was overwhelmed. The thought that the younger ones in the tribe would not have to go hungry anymore moved him deeply, and he thanked Seitaro with great warmth. Seitaro smiled and told him that once they reached town, he would find them a trader they could trust to deal with fairly. That night, everyone settled down and fell asleep around the dying fire. In the darkness, not far away, goblins moved quietly through the shadows. The hobgoblin stood among them and slammed its fist into the ground with sudden violence, making the smaller goblins cry out in fright. It glared around at them, and then without any warning drove its fist into one of the goblins and sent it flying through the air. The goblin hit the ground with blood streaming from its nose. The crash was loud enough to reach the campsite. Luce stirred and woke up at the sound. One of the young kobolds woke up beside her, still half asleep and confused, asking in a drowsy voice what was happening and pointing out that it was not morning yet. Luce smiled softly and told it to go back to sleep, that everything was fine. Back in the woods, the hobgoblin continued its rampage, swinging another goblin through the air and sending it crashing to the ground, and it landed directly in front of Luce, who had stepped outside. The goblin looked up at her from the ground. Behind it, the hobgoblin loomed over everything, fixing its eyes on Luce and grinning with drool hanging from its mouth. Luce looked back at it without flinching, her expression calm and serious. The hobgoblin roared and kept its sharp gaze locked on her. Then Luce's eyes flared with something fierce. A slimy liquid burst from her hand and surged forward toward the hobgoblin with speed and force. The creature let out a cry of pain. The goblin standing nearby went completely still, staring as the slime swallowed the hobgoblin whole in a single motion. Then, in an instant, Luce shifted back into her human form as though nothing unusual had happened. When the goblins turned and saw her standing there, they shrieked in terror. Luce walked calmly toward them. They scattered and ran in blind panic, but as she drew closer they stopped and dropped to the ground, bowing frantically and begging. One of them flinched as she stepped right up to it. Luce looked at them all for a moment, then opened her palms and held something out to them with a gentle smile, saying it might help. The goblins who had been trembling with fear just moments before stared at what she was offering in complete confusion. She placed it in their hands and walked away, leaving them standing there speechless and bewildered, unable to make sense of what had just happened. Morning came. One of the kobolds woke Luce up loudly, telling her it was time to get up. The little kobold she had befriended the night before remarked pointedly that this was what happened when someone stayed up in the middle of the night. Luce crawled out slowly, mumbled a thank you, and was called a sleepyhead in return. She shook herself awake properly and called out cheerful greetings to Seitaro and Chloe. Seitaro was already up and moving through his morning exercises. He greeted them both warmly and asked if they wanted to join in. The little kobold watched the movements with bright eyes and asked excitedly whether this was a dance from Seitaro's homeland. Seitaro smiled and told the kobold he had picked it up very quickly, addressing him by the nickname Morone. Morone then said there was something they needed to ask. The other kobolds in the group wanted nicknames too, just like Morone had been given one. Seitaro was in the middle of preparing breakfast and replied that coming up with nicknames for all of them at once was a little much for him to manage on his own. Chloe looked up with sudden surprise, realizing that he was suggesting she help with the task. Seitaro confirmed it, but said that breakfast came first. When the food was ready and everyone took their first bites, Morone immediately declared it delicious. Seitaro responded with quiet satisfaction. Luce agreed enthusiastically that it was very good. Then the kobold leader arrived and greeted Seitaro with respect, thanking him again for all he had done for the tribe, particularly for his own daughter. Seitaro said it had been his pleasure and asked whether something had brought the leader to them this morning. The leader explained that the hobgoblins from a nearby nest had been making a great deal of noise and causing trouble since early that morning. Seitaro asked whether it was the same group from the previous day. The leader thought it probably was, and explained that goblins tended to think in very simple and direct ways. Seitaro muttered to himself that in that case, it should not be too difficult to drive them off again. The leader said that was very reassuring to hear, and then added a further request. While Seitaro was at it, would it be possible for him to drive off all the goblins in the surrounding area? Seitaro told him gently that they could talk about that later, and that for now they should go and see what the noisy group was actually up to. Luce looked up and asked if her grandfather was going for a walk, and after a short pause it became clear she was coming along. When they arrived and saw what was in front of them, Seitaro paused with a short, quiet sigh. The goblins were on their knees, bowing desperately, and before them stood 3 women surrounded by large piles of food and jewelry that had clearly been taken from somewhere. The goblins watched the group with anxious and uncertain eyes. Seitaro murmured to himself that this was going to require some thought. Luce disagreed immediately and tugged at his sleeve, saying there was nothing confusing about it all. Seitaro pointed out carefully that even though the goblins had clearly given themselves up, all the food and jewelry around them was still evidence of things they had done wrong, and that could not simply be ignored. Luce grinned and announced that she had just thought of a very good idea and told them to leave it to her. Chloe watched her with wide and puzzled eyes, having no idea what she had in mind. Morone came running back to his father with excitement, announcing that he had returned with a good harvest and that there had been no goblins to deal with either. His father smiled warmly at the news, saying it felt like only yesterday that their days had been quiet and uneventful like this. Morone wondered aloud why there had suddenly been so many goblins appearing, saying that the tribe had no idea what the goblins were thinking and that they were simply their enemies. His father muttered with quiet worry about how difficult it had become just to maintain their way of life in the forest. Morone reassured him, telling him not to worry because Seitaro had promised to chase all the goblins away. Somewhere deeper in the forest at that same moment, Luce told the others that her grandfather was actually not going to chase the goblins off. Seitaro gave her a puzzled look. Chloe was equally confused. They both glanced over at the goblins, still kneeling nearby. Chloe leaned in and whispered her concern to Luce. These were goblins they were talking about, and while they had surrendered out of fear, the moment everyone left there was nothing to stop them from coming back and attacking again. Luce smiled and crouched down, drawing something on the ground in front of her. She told them to let her explain why things were actually going to be fine. She laid it out simply and clearly. The reason there had been so many goblins appearing all of a sudden was that food had been running out in the deeper parts of the forest, pushing them outward in search of it. If the kobolds were willing to share some of the food they receive in exchange for their shiny stones with the goblins, the food problem would be solved. In return for that food, the goblins would protect the kobolds from dangerous creatures, making it safe for the kobolds to dig up the stones and bring them to the trader without fear. Everyone listening nodded slowly as the logic of it settled over them. Seitaro asked Luce a careful question. What would happen if the goblins broke the agreement? Luce went quiet for a moment, and then answered thoughtfully. The goblins could not trade the stones for food themselves, so if they wanted to keep receiving food, they would have no choice but to honor the agreement. She turned and looked at the goblins directly as she said it. Chloe was still not entirely convinced, and raised the concern of what would happen if a bad goblin decided to attack a kobold anyway. Luce answered that simply too. The other goblins would deal with the one that broke the rules, just as the kobolds would deal with a bad kobold among their own, and just as people in the wider world punished those among them who did wrong. She asked the goblins whether she had understood correctly. The goblin nodded. Seitaro looked at Luce with a warm and quietly proud smile. Elsewhere, the sound of swords clashing rang out through the air. A voice called out that someone had taken a hit to the arm. Gould asked whether that was the last of the monsters. Jilk told him to do the counting himself. Gould said with breezy confidence that if the monsters ever went wild again, he was pretty sure the 2 of them could handle everything on their own now. Jilk was less certain, muttering that he was not so sure about that, and thinking to himself that Seitaro would probably end up saving them again at some point, in some place or another, without any warning. Gould laughed it off and agreed that the old man would probably swoop in before they even knew what was happening. Back in the village afterward, Gould stood quietly and wondered aloud where Seitaro was at that moment. Jilk replied that there was no knowing, but that he was probably somewhere out there getting caught up in helping someone again, as he always seemed to do. At that same time, in Alkin, Seitaro set the food down and announced that everything was ready. As the group ate together, the women with them reacted with delight, saying they had never tasted anything like it before and marveling at how good it was. Seitaro told them to take their time, as there was plenty more. He then raised his wand and activated a reconnaissance spell, and a map of the surrounding area appeared instantly in front of him. He studied it and murmured that there was a bandit hideout nearby. Chloe remarked that there seemed to be more of those kinds of people around than she had expected. Seitaro observed that the area was probably very different from the kind of forest the elves lived in. Luz turned to the women beside her and told them cheerfully that her grandfather would keep them safe from the dangerous people. Seitaro smiled and said that if anyone came looking for trouble, he would simply have to drive them off, but first he asked whether the women would not mind washing the plates. While the dishes were being cleaned, the women talked among themselves about Seitaro. One of them said he seemed so genuinely kind, and yet was clearly remarkable in ways that were hard to fully take in. A masterful cook who had gotten goblins to surrender without raising a hand against them. Another added that from everything they had heard about his journey to get there, it seemed he had dealt with all manner of monsters and bandits along the way. The dark-haired woman among them said she had never in her life come across a man who was capable of doing things like that. Luce listened to all of this and then said with quiet pride that her grandfather was strong because he was kind. The woman looked at Luce with something soft and thoughtful in her eyes and murmured that Luce was lucky to have him. Not long after, they found themselves facing the bandits. The three of them fought hard while the women stayed protected behind a barrier that kept them safely out of harm's way. One of the women watched the fight with blank and distant eyes, and something shifted inside her as she did. A quiet thought formed that perhaps it would be better for her to keep traveling rather than return to the country she had come from. When it was all over, a town came into view not far ahead of them on the road. Chloe pointed ahead with excitement, recognizing the town they had been making their way toward. It was Alkin, their destination at last. Seitaro told them all that they had done a tremendous job getting there. A few days earlier, Chloe had been watching Seitaro with wide and amazed eyes as he demonstrated a particular way of using magic, casting 2 spells in quick and continuous succession to achieve a surprisingly high speed of travel. She called it an innovative use of magic and said it was genuinely remarkable, though she admitted that very few people would actually be capable of pulling it off in practice. Luce had watched with sparkling eyes, declaring that she wanted to be able to use cool magic like that too. Both Seitaro and Chloe looked at her with a slightly complicated expression. Seitaro scratched his face. He would have loved nothing more than to teach her, but something was holding him back from saying so outright. Chloe gently filled in the gap, telling Luce kindly that she might simply not be very well suited to magic, given how hard she had already tried without being able to manage it. Luce's face fell. Chloe caught herself quickly and added that she was sure there had to be a good approach out there somewhere that would work for her. Seitaro reached over and patted Luce on the head. He told her that whether or not she could use magic, it did not change anything about who she was. She was still Luce, exactly as she had always been, the best granddaughter anyone could ever ask for. He also pointed out that she was already quite good at hand-to-hand combat, which was nothing to overlook. Luce's expression lifted immediately, and she announced with fresh determination that she was going to get so much stronger. Seitaro wondered aloud with a thoughtful expression whether the real issue might actually be that her physical strength was simply so extraordinary that it left her magic unusually weak. An odd situation, but not impossible. Luce seized on this explanation with enthusiasm and declared that her strength was exactly how she was going to protect her grandfather. After that, they parted ways with the women they had been traveling with for a time. The women thanked them with genuine warmth, and Seitaro waved them off and wished them a safe journey home. Chloe asked what came next. Seitaro said his first thought was to go and pay a visit to the local shrine. When the three of them arrived and saw it for the first time, they all stopped and stared in open amazement. The shrine was built on top of the lake itself. Seitaro murmured with quiet wonder that it was not made of stone as he had expected, but largely of wooden planks. Luce looked around with bright eyes and said it looked like a big ship rocking gently on the water, and pointed out that it seemed like nearly half of the whole town was built over the lake. The three of them took it all in as they stepped inside, still visibly impressed. Inside, Seitaro called the other two over and introduced them to a man standing at the heart of the shrine. The man introduced himself as Salcedo, the head priest of the Alkin shrine. Luce introduced herself brightly as Seitaro's granddaughter and told him the shrine was beautiful. Chloe followed with her own introduction, telling him her name and that she was a wood elf. Salcedo smiled at the two of them and said what delightful guests they were, adding that Alkin was a wonderful town and that he felt sure Seitaro and his companions would find plenty to enjoy there. Seitaro replied that it certainly seemed that way. Salcedo then mentioned that word had reached them from their all-father, Israel himself, asking the shrine to be of whatever use they could to Seitaro. He made it clear that if there was anything Seitaro needed, he only had to ask. Seitaro thanked him graciously, but said that his intention was to trouble them as little as possible and that Salcedo should not worry himself on his behalf. Salcedo waved this off with a grin, saying that carrying out the All-Father's wishes was something they took genuine pleasure in and that it was no trouble at all. Seitaro said he understood, and that if something came up he would be sure to let them know. Salcedo pressed further, telling him that no request was too small and that he should come to them for anything at all. Seitaro promised he would come straight to them if he found himself in need of something. Luce had already drifted away, gazing upward at a large and brilliantly colored painting on the wall. She called out that it was incredible and that the inside of the shrine felt nothing like a tent despite being built the way it was. Then a cat let out a meow nearby, and Chloe turned her head toward the sound. The black cat meowed again. Salcedo mentioned that he would also speak to the heads of all the guilds in town on Seitaro's behalf, which Seitaro thanked him for. He then gently rounded up his two companions and began to head out. Luce spotted the cat and cried out that it was adorable, and then in the very next breath announced with excitement that Israel was there too. Israel gestured quickly and urgently for her to keep her voice down, explaining that his being there would cause quite a commotion if people became aware of it. Seitaro greeted him with warm amusement, noting that they had only just arrived, and here Israel was already. He asked lightly whether Israel was quite sure he should not be attending to his responsibilities rather than appearing here. Israel smiled and said simply that Seitaro and Luce were special to him. Seitaro looked around at the shrine with genuine appreciation and remarked on what he observed. Every city seemed to have its own carefully built shrine, its own dedicated priests, and its own people who truly and deeply believed in Israel's teachings. Each place had developed its own prayers, its own rituals, its own statues and paintings, all as ways of feeling closer to him. It was a remarkable thing. Israel smiled quietly at this. Then he looked toward a painting on the wall and asked Seitaro whether it looked like him. Seitaro remarked that he had been wondering why Israel had come to find them so soon after their arrival, and asked whether the life of a god was truly that uneventful that he had nothing better to do. Israel said that was not the reason at all. What Seitaro had asked him for some time ago had finally been completed, and that was why he had come. Chloe stood nearby, clearly nervous in the presence of someone she had only ever heard about in rumors. She introduced herself quietly, saying she was Chloe, a wood elf, and that she had heard things about him, but that standing here now was something else entirely. Seitaro murmured to himself that, of course, Chloe had never actually met Israel before. Israel smiled at her and offered a warm greeting, saying it was nice to meet her. He seemed mildly curious about the rumors she had mentioned. Then he told the group that today he wanted to show them something of what a god was truly capable of. He held out a mirror and offered it to Seitaro. Chloe leaned in and immediately sensed something significant about it, noting with awe that there was an enormous amount of magic concentrated within the mirror. Seitaro took it with a sound of delighted recognition, clearly understanding exactly what it was and thanking Israel with genuine gratitude. Israel asked whether he would like to try it right away. Before he could answer, Luce called out from nearby that she had brought the cat over. Seitaro thanked her. Luce looked at the mirror curiously and said it looked like a larger version of one she had seen Israel carry. Seitaro confirmed that it was, and then opened the mirror and told her to look at what happened. The black cat flinched at the sudden movement. Luce stared and let out a sound of pure amazement. In the surface of another mirror far away, a face appeared looking back at them. It was Ponia. She reacted with delight and disbelief, saying she could see them and that she had no idea how it worked, but that it was the most amazing thing she had ever seen. Beside her, a small girl cried out that it was Luce. Nina came running over and pressed herself close to get a better look, barely able to believe what she was seeing. She reached out and touched the cat on her end, thanking it with overflowing warmth. Her face appeared in the mirror, smiling. Luce's whole face lit up at the sight of it. She jumped with happiness, putting together at last what the wonderful surprise had been all along. Seitaro smiled and admitted he had ended up showing her a little sooner than he had originally planned. Chloe turned back to practical matters and asked Seitaro where they were headed next. Seitaro said it was a good question and laid out what needed to be done. The group of bandits they had driven off earlier needed to be reported to the Adventurers Guild. As a merchant, he also needed to introduce himself to the Commerce Guild. He looked ahead and suggested they think through what order made the most sense to tackle things. Chloe murmured something about the pleasant breeze coming off the lake, and then asked whether Seitaro intended to stay in Alkin for a while. He said that was the plan, which meant they would also need to give some thought to where they were going to be staying. Luce immediately made her own priority clear, saying she wanted to go wherever the food was good. Seitaro pointed out that the Commerce Guild would likely be able to answer a lot of their questions and suggested that they start there, use what they learned to decide on lodgings, drop off their belongings, and then head to the market. He asked what the others thought. Chloe asked whether it would be all right for her to come along with him for all of it. Seitaro said of course, adding that he had more or less assumed she would. Luce asked her grandfather cheerfully what exactly he was planning to do while they were in Alkin. He said it would be nice to sell things directly to customers the way a proper peddler does. Chloe asked whether he meant he was thinking of opening his own shop. Luce echoed the question with surprise, eyes wide. Seitaro said it would only be a temporary arrangement and something small. He was thinking of serving individual cups of his own tea and coffee, and for customers who wanted to take something home, he would sell tea leaves and coffee beans stored in Ponia's canisters. He pictured a small and simple stall where he could also serve straightforward dishes. While he was talking, someone had slipped in behind them without anyone noticing. Luce was still bubbling with excitement, telling her grandfather she wanted to eat his food at the stall too. He told her warmly that she could be his official taste tester. Then a hand landed on Seitaro's shoulder from behind. A man stepped forward and addressed him bluntly. He asked whether Seitaro was the one called Asao. Seitaro looked down at the hand on his shoulder and then turned to face the man, asking calmly what this was all about. Chloe reacted with sharp indignation at the rudeness of barging in on them like this. Nearby, the cat let out a hiss. Then a familiar woman stepped out from behind a man. The man turned back to Seitaro with a cold expression and said that Seitaro might not know who he was, but he certainly knew who Seitaro was. Seitaro's expression shifted and became serious. In the town of Ilken, the man introduced himself as Alahan. He said he was fairly well known in that part of the world and that he simply could not stand by and leave a traveler struggling on their own. Seitaro looked at him with genuine confusion, not understanding what he was referring to. Alahan waved it off in a casual and slightly dismissive way, saying that everyone had their own struggles and that whatever was going on, these people could sort it out between themselves from here. Seitaro said plainly that he had no idea what the man was talking about. Chloe and Luce exchanged a glance, equally baffled. Chloe remarked quietly that none of it made sense, pointing out that this was Seitaro's first time in this town and wondering whether Alahan might have simply mistaken him for someone else. Seitaro nodded at the possibility. Then Alahan turned and called back to someone behind him, saying that the woman he was with had arrived and asking her again whether this old man was really the right person. He had the right name, but something about it still seemed to give Alahan pause. The woman confirmed with certainty that it was him. Chloe let out a surprised sound. Seitaro murmured quietly to himself. The woman stepped forward with a smile, addressing Seitaro directly. She told him it was her, and explained that she had lost sight of him while she was registering at the guild and had been searching everywhere for him ever since. Alahan looked between the woman and Seitaro with a cold and measuring expression, asking flatly whether this was truly the right person and not some kind of misunderstanding. He swept his gaze over the group with obvious skepticism. Chloe shrank back a little under the look. Alahan muttered his assessment to himself. An old man, a wood elf, and a child. They did not look married, and they did not look like a family either. He told them with a hard edge in his voice that Ilken was a good town and that they had better not cause any trouble in it. Then he left. Chloe thought to herself that he was genuinely frightening and managed to stammer out a yes before he was gone. Seitaro turned his attention back to the woman and addressed her in a friendly way. She reacted with playful indignation, asking whether he had already forgotten her. She reminded him that her name was Kanade. Seitaro recalled her then, saying he had thought she had gone home along with the others from their earlier encounter. Luce looked at her with a blank and unreadable stare. Seitaro told her he understood now why she had been looking for them. Kanade then made her request directly and with clear feeling. She said she could be useful to him and asked him to please take her along on his travels. Seitaro told her he did not mind, but suggested she take a little more time to think it over carefully before deciding. Chloe reacted to this with visible surprise, clearly not having expected such an easy and open response. Luce, meanwhile, kept her sharp gaze fixed on Kanade without saying anything. Seitaro told Kanade simply that they were heading around to the guilds and shops, and that she was welcome to come along with them if she wished. Kanade's face broke into relief and joy, and she thanked him repeatedly with overflowing gratitude. Chloe watched her with an expression that was not quite sure what to make of the situation. At the Ilken Commerce Guild, Seitaro reminded himself quietly that with 80's letter of introduction in hand, things should go reasonably smoothly. They approached the front desk, and Seitaro introduced himself politely, saying his name was Asao and that he planned to work as a peddler in the town for a period of time, and asking whether he could register there. The woman at the desk greeted him warmly and said of course. Seitaro passed over the letter addressed to the guild master. The woman told him she would take it through immediately and asked them to wait for a moment. Seitaro let out a quiet sigh, and they settled onto a sofa to wait. Before long, a woman came through to meet them. She introduced herself as Illumina, the guild master. Seitaro greeted her and said it was very kind of her to come out personally for someone who was only a traveling merchant. Illumina brushed off the modesty entirely, saying a mere peddler was quite an understatement. She pointed out that 80 was not the kind of person who sat down and hand-wrote a letter for just anyone. Seitaro held to his position and said that regardless, he truly was just a merchant who had been traveling around selling tea leaves and coffee beans. Illumina smiled and said that 80 had told her as much, but had also described the quality of his goods as something she had never encountered before at that level. She added that it was unusual for 80 to be so straightforward and enthusiastic in her praise of anything, which was exactly why the description had stayed with her. Seitaro responded with mild amusement, remarking that 80 had always seemed to have a bit of a competitive side to her. Illumina revealed that 80 was actually an old friend of hers, and that the two of them exchanged letters on a personal basis from time to time, outside of any business dealings. Seitaro asked whether she would like to try some of what he was selling for herself. Illumina responded with immediate and genuine excitement, saying she would be absolutely delighted and admitting that what she had heard had been making her curious ever since. She also realized aloud that this meant he would be selling his coffee right there in Ilken. Seitaro began to pour the coffee. Illumina drew in a slow breath the moment the aroma reached her, already struck by the depth and richness of it before she had even taken a sip. Seitaro mentioned that he had ground the beans fresh just before coming to meet her. Illumina mentioned that she had heard Seitaro had been genuinely helpful to the city of Foz in ways that went well beyond his business dealings. Seitaro responded with light surprise, saying it seemed she knew considerably more about him than he had expected, and admitted he was now a little worried about exactly what Adi had written in that letter. He paused for a moment and then steered the conversation in a new direction, telling Illumina that while she clearly knew quite a bit about him already, he had actually been thinking of running a somewhat different kind of business in this particular town. Illumina's interest was immediately piqued, and she asked what he had in mind. Seitaro explained that the goods themselves would be the same, but the way he intended to sell them would be different. Illumina found this genuinely interesting and asked whether he would still be willing to sell his goods to the guild directly alongside this new venture. Seitaro picked up a pen and began drawing something on a piece of paper and told her that yes, he absolutely planned to sell in bulk to the guild as well. He slid the drawing across toward her. He had been thinking of something like what he had sketched out, a small and simple setup that would not get in the way of the surrounding shops or cause any inconvenience to customers passing by. Illumina looked at the drawing with delight and remarked on how small and cozy it was. Behind Seitaro, Luz stared at the drawing with her mouth hanging open, completely unable to make out what it was meant to be. Seitaro told Illumina that this was actually where he was hoping she might be able to help them. Illumina responded with immediate enthusiasm, saying that if that was what he needed, then of course they could help, and that it would actually be useful for the guild as well. Seitaro added that he had no wish to step on the toes of any existing coffee shops in the area, and that as a gesture of thanks for her help, he would also sell her his tea leaves in bulk this time around. Illumina thought it over and noted that most of the good spots near the market had already been claimed by existing food stalls. Then she suggested an idea with a decisive and confident air. Why not set up the stand right beside the guild itself? That way, it would also make it immediately clear to anyone who saw it that he was there with the guild's official backing. Seitaro looked at her with mild amusement, remarking that she certainly had a taste for bold decisions. Before the conversation could continue further, there was movement behind them, and Luz appeared, making her presence known with her usual energy. She introduced herself brightly to Illumina, announcing her full name and that Seitaro was her grandfather. Seitaro told her gently that all she really needed to say was her name. Illumina smiled at Luz warmly and said what a responsible young girl she was. Seitaro then said that there was no point in waiting when the moment was right. He would get everything ready and start the following day. As they prepared to leave, Illumina waved them off, and they waved back cheerfully as they went. The moment they were out of the room, a man who had been quietly present throughout the conversation spoke up with a scowl. He expressed his disbelief that Illumina had simply let them go like that, pointing out that she was known for being one of the coldest and most guarded guild masters around, and yet she had been unusually warm and accommodating with this old man. Illumina looked at him steadily without answering immediately. The man pressed on, laying out what was bothering him. The goods Seitaro was selling were of the highest quality and in large quantities, and yet nobody had any idea where they were actually coming from. He said he had never heard of anything so suspicious, and raised a concern that they could be stolen goods. Illumina acknowledged that it was a strange situation, and mentioned that Adi had brought up the same question herself. But she pointed out to the man, who she addressed as Shirohin, that if the goods had come from any kind of criminal activity, there would almost certainly be at least a rumor or two floating around somewhere. Shirohin was not satisfied with that answer alone. He moved on to a different point. It made no sense, he argued, that someone who could make a very large profit simply by selling his goods wholesale to the guild would instead want to open a tiny food stand and spend time and effort making what amounted to very small earnings. Illumina agreed that the numbers did not entirely add up. Shirohin continued, saying that selling goods at the kinds of low prices Seitaro seemed to favor without any apparent care for profit could easily undercut shop owners who were running honest businesses and trying to make a living. Illumina let out a quiet sigh, acknowledging that all of these thoughts had already crossed her own mind. Shirohin picked up the cup of coffee that had been left on the table and sniffed it with skepticism, asking whether this was the coffee Seitaro had made. He took a sip. After a moment, he muttered that it was not bad. Illumina smiled quietly at his reaction. Night settled over Alkin. The sound of water moving with some force caught Chloe's attention, and she looked out with wide eyes. The surface of the lake appeared to be glowing softly, dotted all over with small points of light dancing across the water. She exclaimed at how beautiful it was. Kanade told her with a calm and knowing smile that this was not actually an unusual sight in this part of the world, at least not at this time of year. Many of the local fishermen went out at night to fish, and they used lantern stones to attract a particular kind of fish known as firefly fish, which was what created the glowing effect across the lake. Chloe looked at Kanade with admiration and said she seemed to know so much about the lake, pointing out how enormous it was and saying there must be so much more she could share about it. Luz piped up and said she wanted to see too. Chloe reached over and lifted her up so that she could get a proper look at the glowing water stretching out before them. Kanade said quietly that this town was where she had grown up, so everything she knew about it had simply come with living there rather than from any deliberate effort to learn. She then turned the conversation around and asked about Seitaro instead, wanting to know more about him. She asked Chloe and Luz whether they had been traveling with him the whole time, and said that even though he had described himself as just a merchant, she got the feeling there was more to him than that. Chloe said he was a genuinely mysterious person, difficult to fully pin down. Luz thanked her for saying so. Kanade murmured that it seemed the two of them felt the same way she did about him. Luz then said with obvious pride that her grandfather happened to be close friends with a very powerful god. Kanade reacted with genuine amazement, telling Luce that was incredible. The conversation about Seitaro continued warmly between the three of them. Then something caught Chloe's eye, a flash of light somewhere in the distance. There for just a moment, and then gone again almost before she could be sure she had seen it. Not far away, Seitaro was washing his face outside. The bushes nearby rustled, and he paused. Israel stepped out from among them and greeted him in his usual calm and easy manner, saying it had been a little while. Seitaro responded briefly with mild amusement. Israel smiled and asked whether he might join him. Seitaro said he did not mind at all. Israel looked around at the outdoor bathing setup Seitaro had arranged and expressed admiration for it. Seitaro replied with quiet humor, wondering aloud how one was supposed to properly respond to receiving a compliment from a god. He then murmured to himself that there was truly nothing like an outdoor bath. Israel then asked Seitaro a more personal question, whether he ever found himself wanting to return to the world he had originally come from. Seitaro smiled and said he genuinely did not think he did. He murmured that this was a good world, that the food was good and the people were kind. Israel said that as the All-Father, it was comforting to hear. He then admitted honestly that Seitaro had surprised him somewhat. The way he lived and behaved in this world was quite different from the people Israel had reincarnated before him. Gentler, kinder in a way that stood out. Seitaro acknowledged this and said there was probably a reason for it. He explained that ever since arriving in this world, whenever he spoke with people he found himself thinking about what it would be like if that person were Takumi. Israel told him gently that Takumi was doing well, healthy, and growing up fine. Seitaro took this in quietly and said that knowing that made everything feel worthwhile. If he had been brought here in Takumi's place, and Takumi was safe and growing up well, then it had been the right thing. He smiled again and said it was a genuine relief to hear. After a little while they went back inside together. Seitaro came across a piece of unfamiliar technology and examined it with interest, finding it very curious. Israel guided him in how to use it, telling him where to direct his magic and what to do with the wind function. When they were done, Israel sat back with a deeply satisfied expression and declared that it had been a truly wonderful bath, saying it was the kind of thing that brought a person back to life. Seitaro responded with light amusement, pointing out that this was quite the statement coming from a god. He added, though, that he would never argue with the restorative power of a good bath. Israel agreed wholeheartedly, saying it healed the mind, body, and soul all at once. Seitaro remarked that Luce and the others seemed to still have quite a lot of energy left in them even at that hour. Israel said he was also grateful to Seitaro for having agreed to take Luce in and look after her. Seitaro smiled and said it was no trouble at all. She was a good child, honest and straightforward in the best way. Israel thanked him with deep and genuine warmth. The night slowly deepened around them. The next morning arrived with bright weather. A cheerful voice announced that conditions were perfect and that it was time to open up the shop. Chloe reflected that the preparations had been so intense and fast-paced that the whole process had passed in something of a blur. Seitaro said he could not have gotten it all done without everyone's help. Luce was practically bouncing with excitement, announcing that the shop was going to have potato chips, her absolute favorite, as well as fried dough cookies, and declaring with full confidence that the customers were going to be very happy. Kanade agreed, swept up in the excitement of the moment. Seitaro smiled to himself and thought that Luce had clearly grown out of the shyness she had shown when they first met. Children, he thought, grew up so quickly. Later that morning, they made their way to the Alkan Commerce Guild. Standing at the entrance to meet them were Illumina, the guild master, a man named Shirohin, who was the submaster, and a woman named Sakia, who represented the shop owners of the guild. Illumina greeted them warmly, saying they had been expecting him and that the moment had finally arrived. Shirohin introduced himself in a far less welcoming tone, making it immediately clear that if Seitaro caused any trouble for the other guild members, they would shut him down without hesitation. The warning was delivered with cold directness. Seitaro was mildly taken aback by the sharpness of it. Chloe's face tightened with visible irritation at the tone. Illumina stepped in and redirected the conversation, telling Shirohin that she needed to speak with him about the goods Seitaro would be selling them. Seitaro noted to himself that this time they were going to try his tea. He poured some for them and mentioned that everything he would be selling to the guild was of consistently fine quality. Sakia brought the cup to her lips, took a sip, and her expression transformed completely. She could not believe what she was tasting. Sakia turned to Shirohin with urgency in her voice, telling him that they absolutely had to purchase this tea for the guild. It was top class, unlike anything she had ever tasted. Seitaro told them calmly that the decision was entirely theirs to make, just as the decision of whether to sell to them was entirely his. Shirohin acknowledged that the quality was exceptional, but pointed out that the price and the quantity being offered were unlike anything they had ever dealt with before in their experience. Everyone around the table took a sip and fell into thoughtful silence. Chloe and Seitaro watched them quietly without saying anything. Then Illumina spoke. She said that both the coffee and the tea would bring the guild a solid profit, and that while the price was higher than what they were used to paying, she had decided to go ahead and purchase the agreed amount. Shirohin gave a stiff and reluctant acknowledgement that the final decision belonged to the guild master and that the amount was hers to determine. But he added a pointed warning directed at Seitaro, saying that if anything strange went on with that food stand, he had better watch himself. Seikiya tried gently to ease the tension. Chloe snapped. She raised her voice in anger, demanding to know why Seitaro would ever do anything wrong. Luce's expression twisted with the same anger, and she backed Chloe up loudly, declaring that he absolutely would not. Seitaro stepped over to Luce and placed a gentle hand on her head. She looked up at him and asked quietly whether he was not upset. He smiled and told her it was all right. She repeated his name softly, still looking up at him. Kanade called out to Seitaro as well, and Chloe added firmly that they were not happy about how things had been said, even if the matter was settled. Seitaro gestured for calm and then addressed Shirohin directly. He asked him to at least come and see what their stand was actually about for himself and make his own judgment from there. Shirohin looked away and said stiffly that he had already been planning on doing exactly that. Seikiya looked at him with a puzzled expression, asking why he cared so much about all of this. Shirohin ignored her question and turned back to Seitaro, saying what had been bothering him plainly. Seitaro called himself just a peddler, and yet the quality and the quantity of his goods were on the level of a large-scale trader. He said he suspected there was some kind of mastermind or larger operation behind all of it. The room fell quiet. Later, the center of town was busy and full of life. Customers came to the stand one after another. A woman placed her order for iced tea. Chloe took it down carefully. Nearby, Seitaro was at the cooking side of things and called out to Luce to slow down. From a distance, Shirohin stood watching the stand alongside Seikiya, studying it with narrowed eyes. He told himself to keep watching, that he would figure out what this man was really about. He was convinced that business was built on trust and that someone appearing out of nowhere with no history and no known background could not possibly sustain what he was doing. The world of business, he thought, did not work that way. Not far from the stand, a woman walked away saying the staff had been so pleasant and that she would love to come back. A man nearby mentioned that his own bread shop had been selling more since the stand had opened next door, and the foot traffic it brought was helping everyone around it. Kanade, hearing this, said simply that they were just glad the customers were happy. Shirohin scowled at all the positive reactions around him, muttering to himself that people were only drawn to it because it was new and exciting. Then his frustration got the better of him, and he decided he was going to go and talk to Seitaro himself. Luce greeted him brightly when he approached the stand, starting to ask what he would like. Her words stopped short when she recognized who it was, and she flinched. Shirohin told her in a flat voice to calm down, and that he was just there as a customer. He took a seat and looked around, studying the operation quietly. He noted to himself that because everything was takeout-based, the space never became overcrowded. But the prices were far too low in his view, and sooner or later that had to start affecting the shops nearby. The limited number of items on the menu kept lines from forming, which was clearly intentional. From nearby, Seikiya watched with a quiet sigh, knowing there was no stopping him once he got like this. Shirohin continued to turn it over in his head, unable to work out how anyone could charge so little and still keep things running. Seitaro came over and greeted him cheerfully, welcoming him and letting him know about the day's special, iced tea, and asking whether he would like to try it. Shirohin gave him a sharp look. Seitaro asked him calmly what he thought now that he had actually seen the place for himself. Shirohin admitted that it appeared to be doing well, but said there were still a lot of things that did not add up for him. Luce peeked out from behind the counter, watching the exchange with anxious eyes. Shirohin said he had a few questions. Seitaro told him he did not mind at all. Shirohin made his position clear from the start. He was not warm and agreeable like Seikiya, and he was not someone who would put the guild's overall profits above the well-being of its individual members the way he felt Illumina sometimes did. Seitaro smiled and said that the man's stubbornness and sharp manner, for all their roughness, seemed to come from a genuinely good place. Shirohin shot to his feet and demanded to know if Seitaro had just called him nasty. The people nearby began to take notice. Seitaro suggested they continue the conversation somewhere less public. He guided Shirohin to one side. Shirohin explained what was really bothering him. Every so often, someone came along who did not seem to operate by any of the normal rules of how business was done. Seitaro asked what he meant by normal rules. Shirohin said it was obviously not normal. The prices were not normal, the quality was not normal. None of it made sense under any framework he knew. Seitaro admitted he was not sure what to say to that. Shirohin pressed further, saying there had to be some hidden motive behind all of it, some angle he was not showing. Seitaro smirked slightly and told him that if he really wanted to know what he was actually up to, he could simply tell him. The town center was lively and full of people going about their day. Customers sat and ate and enjoyed themselves at the stand. Kanade glanced up and noticed something. Shirohin and Seitaro had slipped away together somewhere. She watched them go without saying anything. Nearby, Seikiya hesitated and then called over to Illumina. She raised her concern about Shirohin, saying that he had never thought well of the stand from the beginning, and wondering aloud whether if anything even slightly went wrong, he might blow it into a much bigger problem than it needed to be. The two of them quietly imagined how Shirohin would typically react in a situation like that, and neither image was particularly reassuring. Illumina said she could not promise that would not happen, but pointed out that as far as she was concerned, the stand was clearly loved by the customers and was doing very well, and that was what mattered most to her. Seikiya admitted that she did understand where Shirohin was coming from, even if his manner was difficult. Illumina agreed that his concerns were not entirely without basis, but added firmly that this did not give him the right to interfere with guild affairs. Sakia muttered that the food was simply so good that she thought he was making far too much out of it, and wondered why he had to be so impossibly stubborn. Illumina said she did not know the answer to that, but agreed that things could not continue the way they were going. Sakia added that Shirohan was very skilled at his job, which meant he was fully capable of finding some kind of problem with the stand if he set his mind to it and using that to try to shut it down. That, she said, was a real concern. Kanade came over with an additional order of iced tea and potato chips for the table. Illumina looked at it and said everything looked wonderful and that everything from his stand had been amazing. Sakia said dryly that this was actually the heart of the problem. Not far away, Chloe noticed that Luce seemed troubled and asked her what was wrong, wondering whether she was just tired. Luce turned to her with a worried expression and told her that the shop might be in danger of being shut down. Chloe reacted with alarm and asked how that had happened and when, pressing Luce to tell her everything. Back at the table, Illumina murmured to herself that the guild naturally wanted to build a strong and lasting relationship with Seitaro, given the exceptional quality of what he was able to supply them with. Just then another person arrived and called out to the two of them, asking what the serious faces were about. Illumina recognized the newcomer as Taeonian, the person in charge of food matters at the guild, and remarked that this was only going to make the situation more complicated. Sakia summed things up as briefly as she could, saying that the situation came down to Shirohan. Chloe and Luce had quietly positioned themselves nearby and were listening carefully to every word being exchanged. Sakia continued, saying that no one could quite work out why he was doing it, but it seemed his intention was to find a way to close the stand down. Then Kanade spoke up quietly. She said it was going to be all right. Everyone turned to look at her with puzzled expressions. She said the same thing again, calmly and with quiet certainty. Then she directed their attention to the menu and asked them to take a careful look at it. Sakia said she could see what was written on it, but she could not understand how that made the situation any better. Kanade pointed out something that had not been fully considered. The vast majority of customers coming to the stand were tasting coffee and tea for the very first time in their lives. Illumina's expression shifted as something clicked into place, and she murmured that she thought she could see where this was going. Chloe, still listening from her hiding spot, whispered in confusion that she had no idea what they were talking about. Kanade continued explaining. Because the stand was only running for a limited time, once it closed its doors for good, all of those new customers who had discovered they enjoyed coffee and tea would naturally start looking for somewhere else in the city to get it. The stand was essentially introducing an entirely new group of people to these drinks, and then sending them out to find other shops once the stand was gone. Illumina finished the thought, saying that in other words the stand would actually benefit the city's businesses over the long run rather than harm them. Kanade confirmed that this was exactly it, and added that she did not think Shirohan himself was an unreasonable person at his core. The table fell into a quiet and thoughtful silence, with everyone seeming to arrive at the same understanding at roughly the same moment. Some distance away, Shirohan was still chewing over his doubts, and said again that the whole thing was definitely strange. Seitaro suggested he look over at something nearby. Shirohan asked with some irritation what he was supposed to be looking at. Seitaro pointed out that the young people from both their sides had found each other and were getting along wonderfully deep in animated conversation. Shirohan observed that they did seem to be talking quite a lot. Seitaro suggested they sit down. Shirohan agreed. Once they were seated, Shirohan said something that shifted the tone. He told Seitaro plainly that he had not come here to pick a fight with him. What he could not do, however, was stand by quietly while Seitaro carelessly undercut the other businesses in the city. He pointed out that Seitaro was already making plenty of money from his wholesale dealings with the guild, and asked with genuine bewilderment why he would even bother running a food stand on top of all of that. Shirohan waited for an answer. Seitaro glanced at him and turned the question back around, asking whether Shirohan really thought he had not considered the well-being of the businesses in the city at all. Shirohan admitted that, to be fair, it was becoming clear that Seitaro had actually thought about it considerably more than he had initially assumed. The customers who had developed a taste for coffee and tea at the stand would naturally go on to visit the local shops once it was gone. He acknowledged that this was what Seitaro had been working toward all along. Seitaro looked away for a moment and said he would tell him the real reason, though he wondered whether Shirohan would truly understand it. Shirohan stayed quiet and waited for him to continue. Seitaro began by saying that despite everything, Shirohan did seem like a genuinely good person. Shirohan said nothing. Seitaro continued, saying that what he was about to share might not make complete sense from a business point of view, but the truth was that the stand existed because of the girl traveling with him. He explained that she had a complicated history and a complicated life behind her, and that anyone paying attention could tell she was not an ordinary child. The two of them glanced back toward the stand where Luce was working. Seitaro said that he wanted to give her the chance to experience what it felt like to just be a normal kid, even if only for a little while, and only in small ways. Things like helping out at a shop, learning how to talk to people, being part of something simple and ordinary. He said this was the real reason for the stand. Then he glanced over at Shirohan and stopped. Shirohan was crying. Not quietly. He was sobbing with no attempt to hold it back. He managed to say through his tears that he understood, that he knew exactly what Seitaro meant. Seitaro stared at him, genuinely stunned. Shirohan gathered himself enough to say that he had a son and a daughter of his own at home. Seitaro said that in that case, he probably did understand better than most. Shirohan cried openly that he would do absolutely anything for his children, and that this was simply what it meant to be a parent. Seitaro pointed out gently that he was not technically Luce's parent, though he admitted that in a certain sense, perhaps he was. Taeonyan, who had been watching from nearby, wondered to herself what on earth was happening. Shirohan continued through his tears, saying that raising a child that small entirely on his own was a truly admirable thing to do. He said he was embarrassed, deeply embarrassed, that he had spent so much time suspecting Seitaro of being some kind of infiltrator sent by an outside organization. Seitaro fixed him with a sharp look at the mention of this. Then he told Shirohan that it was all right, as long as he understood now. He added that he would personally prefer to avoid any misunderstandings with the local shops going forward. Shirohan said that if that was what was needed, he would help make it happen himself. Behind them, the bushes rustled. Seitaro turned his head, thinking he had heard something odd back there. Shirohan said it was probably just a stray cat and started to say something more, and then a pair of claws came lunging at him from behind. Shirohan spun around with a shout, completely startled. It was Taeonyan, who announced with cheerful triumph that she had caught him off guard. She teased him about how quickly he made friends even with that intimidating expression he always wore. Shirohan rounded on her and demanded to know how many times he had to tell her not to sneak up on people like that. Taeonyan said sorry without sounding particularly sorry at all, admitting freely that she had done it on purpose, and said that he always made the funniest faces when he was surprised, and she simply could not help herself. Seitaro asked Shirohan whether this was a colleague of his. Taeonyan introduced herself with a bright smile. She explained that she was a therianthrope, and that her role at the Commerce Guild was to handle the procurement of food, though in practice this mostly meant sourcing ingredients. She had heard that the stand was serving some interesting and fun dishes, and had come to see for herself and to say hello. Seitaro greeted her warmly, and thought to himself that she was clearly interested in the food at the stand. Taeonyan confirmed this, and then said that before getting into anything else, they should probably talk about the terms of a possible contract. Seitaro appreciated her interest, but told her honestly that the ingredients being used at the stand were not particularly unusual or hard to find. Taeonyan said she understood that, but explained that this was actually exactly why they were so interested in the recipes themselves. There was enormous potential in what could be done with ordinary ingredients, and that was what had caught their attention. Seitaro murmured that he understood. Shirohan sat quietly for a moment, and then said it seemed to him like there might be a misunderstanding about something. Taeonyan reacted with surprise, and mentioned that the guild had already set aside a budget for this. Seitaro suggested that before any terms or contract were discussed, perhaps they should start by coming to the stand and trying the drinks and dishes for themselves. Taeonyan's face immediately brightened with enthusiasm. She said that was absolutely necessary, and that some people from the guild had brought things back for her to try earlier, but that it had been takeout, and she had only managed a small bite of each item, which was nowhere near enough to get a proper sense of anything. Seitaro said that it would make the whole thing worthwhile if she was happy to participate. Taeonyan declared that they would put everything they had into the taste test. Seitaro added honestly that cooking was not his main work, and that if he were to sell them anything, it would be the method itself, though he admitted that selling was not quite the right word, since he was not in need of money at the moment. Taeonyan eagerly pointed out that they could offer him things other than money in exchange. Seitaro thought this over and suggested that what he would actually appreciate was for them to handle the negotiations and talks with the other shops and merchants in the area. Shirohan grinned and confirmed that this was exactly the kind of work their guild was there for, though he noted that Taeonyan personally disliked doing it. He assured Seitaro that he himself would help this time and told him to leave it to them without worry. After that, the rest of the day passed quietly and without incident. Over at the Foz workshop, Adi arrived and called out for Polonia. Ponia answered from somewhere inside, her hands full, and asked Adi to come to her. She noticed that Adi sounded cheerful. Adi corrected her, saying she was not particularly happy, just that something had caught her attention. Ponia seemed pleasantly surprised. Adi looked around at the space, trying to figure out what it was. A house, a warehouse, and then spotted a counter at the front and reasoned that it must be plans for a large food stand. She could not figure out where the request had come from. Ponia confirmed that she was right and explained that the blueprint had originally come from when Mr. Asao asked her to design an assemblable food stand. Adi was surprised, saying she had known about the tea canisters but had not heard about this. The cat wandered in and meowed. Ponia smiled and said that the work had given her more financial breathing room than expected and had been a good learning experience on top of that. She added that Mr. Asao had also asked her to look after the cat. Adi glanced at the cat and recalled that he used to take it around with him. She asked what Ponia was working on now and whether it had anything to do with the blueprint. Ponia said not exactly, though sort of she was building a cat tower, something Mr. Asao had taught her how to make. Adi remarked that word had come that he had made it safely to Wilkin, and she was sure that by now he was already doing something strange and impressive over there. The cat watched them both with a steady, intent gaze. Elsewhere, a black cat stayed hidden up in a tree. Nearby, a voice rang out thanking everyone for coming to the Kenmuji house that day. Chloe announced that, as promised, Mr. Asao would now be teaching them how to prepare the dishes from a stand. Sakia could barely contain her excitement, saying the moment had finally come, and noted that all the major figures from the guild had shown up for it. Seitaro apologized to the crowd gathered in the inn's kitchen, feeling a little sorry for packing so many people into such a tight space. The owner of the kitchen waved off the apology and said it would be a learning experience for him as well. With that, Seitaro began teaching, and soon everyone was busy with their own tasks. The sound of pans sizzling filled the kitchen. Seitaro gave Chloe a thumbs up when he saw how she was doing. When everything was ready, the dishes were laid out on the table. Someone in the crowd asked whether that was all of it and whether the taste test could begin. Seitaro remarked to himself how impressive the kitchen was, so large and clean. The owner was pleased to hear it and explained that he had been preparing to start a bento business for meetings and events, which was why he had invested in the space. Seitaro noted that the owner was always thinking ahead and brought up the bath as well. The owner lit up at the mention of it and said he owed Seitaro his thanks for that too. Heating such large amounts of water had always cost a great deal, and before he had only been able to run the bath a few times a month. Since Seitaro had been there, however, the bath had been available every single day, and the other guests had been very happy for it. Seitaro said warmly that the pleasure was his, since he and his companion had been using the bath themselves. Luce broke in with obvious delight, saying how much she loved the big bath. Sakia shot Shirohin a smug look. He demanded to know what that face was about. Taeonyan jumped in excitedly, suddenly struck by an idea. The fried foods Mr. Asao had taught them, the fried dough cookies and the potato chips, she thought they would go wonderfully with the city's local specialties, and asked everyone what they thought. Taeonyan suggested that frying fish and shrimp caught from the lake would surely produce something delicious, and that once fried, they could season everything using the method Seitaro had taught them. Seitaro was immediately taken with the idea, and said that in that case, he would have to teach them how to fry fish and shrimp properly, as it was a truly wonderful dish and one of the 3 most beloved from his homeland. The owner of the inn was delighted to hear this, and told Seitaro he was welcome to use the kitchen whenever he liked. Taeonyan suggested they plan it for another time, once they had actually gone out and caught some fish. Seitaro found himself picturing the 2 of them out by the water with fishing rods, and it seemed Luce was imagining the very same thing. When a meal was done, everyone pitched in to clean up together. The following day, Seitaro and Luce made their way to the lakeside. Luce asked him about the difference between fish that lived in lakes and fish that lived in rivers. Kanade remarked quietly to herself that he really did seem to know everything, and that he appeared to understand the lake's fish even better than she did. Seitaro replied modestly that he had simply lived a little longer than her. Then, without warning, both of them went still. They had heard something. A voice they recognized was crying out in desperation, begging for help. Without a moment's hesitation, Luce and Seitaro moved toward the sound. As they drew closer, Seitaro saw that someone was under attack. He recognized the figure immediately. It was Morone, battered and covered in wounds. Morone pleaded urgently with Seitaro, explaining that their group had been on their way to bring shiny rocks to the city when enormous and terrifying creatures had appeared from nowhere and set upon them. Seitaro told him calmly that they would save everyone. Luce called out to her grandfather in alarm, pointing out that Morone was hurt and begging him to help. Morone insisted through his distress that he himself was fine and that the others needed to be saved first. Somewhere nearby, a tremendous explosion went off, and a thunderous roar rolled through the air. Not far away, Alahan had pressed himself against the trunk of a tree, staying out of sight. A group of goblins and kobolds crouched nearby, trembling with fear at the sight of the massive creature before them. Alahan peered out cautiously. The monster loomed over the goblins, an enormous height. They had thrown themselves at it repeatedly, but their attacks had done almost nothing to it. Seitaro observed the situation and noted to himself that a large and fearsome creature had emerged and attacked the group, and was now locked in a losing battle against the goblins. He acknowledged that the goblins from before appeared to be keeping true to their word. Morone confirmed that the creature was simply too large and frightening, and that the goblins were being overpowered. Seitaro asked Morone immediately if there was anything else he had noticed. Morone described how a person in armor had passed through and stepped in to help, though things had not looked good for them either. That armored person had been the one to send Morone off to report the situation to the city. Seitaro wondered aloud whether the person might have been from the city guard or perhaps an adventurer. Morone told him to follow and broke into a run. As they arrived on the scene, Seitaro recognized the armored figure at once. It was Alahan. Alahan spotted him with a start, recognizing the old man from their earlier encounter and noting with bewilderment that the girl was with him too, wondering what on earth had brought them here. He assessed the creature and remarked that it was roughly the size of a troll, though it was unlike any monster he had ever encountered around Alkin. It reminded him somewhat of the golems he had heard stories about, but he had no idea how to defeat it. Seitaro studied it for a moment and said quietly that if it was some kind of golem, he thought he could manage it. Alahan was stunned and demanded to know what he was talking about, reminding him that he was a merchant and telling him to run while he held the thing at bay. Lu spoke up with calm pride and told Alahan that her grandfather was actually very strong. The monster turned its gaze in their direction. Alahan pressed on, insisting that even if it truly was a golem, it was a proper monster and not something to take lightly. He acknowledged that the old man could use magic, but argued that this was something far beyond what he could reasonably handle. He explained that the worst kind of golems were those that had become separated from their creators for one reason or another. He had heard the legend of a whole country that had been destroyed by a golem that had gone rogue, and he was almost certain that this particular golem had gone without a creator for a very long time, which made it extremely dangerous. At that moment, the golem lurched and lunged straight toward them. Luce looked at it with an expression of complete calm and told her grandfather simply that this one no longer had a creator. Seitaro replied that in that case, this should not be too difficult. Alahan stood frozen in disbelief, unable to understand whether either of them had heard a single word he had said. Behind them, the goblins huddled together and shook with fear.